The rock and roll lifestyle sounds fun, but it's gonna take a toll. These rock icons tried to live up to the legends, and one way or another, they all paid a tragic price.
Robert Plant is one of the most legendary singers in rock music history, but his life hasn't been all hit records and world tours. In fact, you might be surprised to hear about some of the rough experiences he's endured. Plant was born in Staffordshire, England, and grew up in a comfortably middle-class house. And his parents pushed him to become an accountant. But Plant had discovered blues music, and he was having trouble pretending to care about his education. As he told The Guardian in 1970, "It was really hard to combine the two and keep a compatible relationship with schoolmasters and parents at the same time as doing what I really wanted to do." Plant left school when he was 17 to pursue his music dreams, which upset his parents. As he recalled, "I got in with this crew, which I'm afraid upset my parents a bit, and the cleft between Mum and Dad and Robert got a bit wider and a bit wider." Luckily for Plant, he managed to make a huge success out of skipping out on that accounting degree, and he managed to eventually patch things up with his folks. As he told Louder in 2020, "I had my moment of professional potential, and because I didn't accept it, I had to leave home when I was 17, so I toughened up pretty quickly. I made my peace with my parents a couple of years later, but it was good. It was what it should be." Although Plant was Led Zeppelin's lead singer, he wasn't the chief executive of the band. That role was filled by guitarist Jimmy Page. 4 years older than Plant, Page was already a seasoned professional musician when he formed the band in 1968. He also had a reputation for being a hard-nosed businessman, so it's not really a surprise that he took the search for a lead singer very seriously. At the time, Plant was a relatively unknown and untested vocalist. Terry Reid, on the other hand, was an established rock singer and songwriter. While he isn't especially famous today, back in the 60s he was a big enough deal to matter to someone like Jimmy Page. So, when Page began putting together the band that would become Led Zeppelin, he invited Reid to be the lead. But Reid had already committed to being the opening act on several tours. He suggested that if Page could wait a few weeks, they could talk. But Page didn't want to wait. Reid actually ended up recommending Plant to Page, and the rest is history. In 1970, life for Robert Plant was pretty good. Led Zeppelin had become enormously successful. He was newly married to his wife Maureen Wilson, and he had a baby daughter named Carmen. They all lived happily on a farm in rural England with their pet dog and some goats. But Plant was about to experience one of the scariest tragedies of his life, one that still haunts him to this day. In 2016, when Plant was testifying in the copyright infringement trial over the song Stairway to Heaven, he was told that in 1970 he had attended a concert by the American rock band Spirit and that he'd even played snooker with one of Spirit's members. But Plant maintains that it's impossible that he stole any aspects of Spirit's song because he doesn't remember any of it. The reason that he couldn't remember either of those events was because he'd been involved in a terrible car crash immediately afterward. His wife suffered a fractured skull, while part of the windshield ended up buried in the top of his head. As a result, he suffered memory loss and didn't remember anything about the earlier events involving Spirit. Being a professional singer puts a lot of strain on the body, especially the respiratory system, throat, and vocal cords. Inexperienced singers often strain their voices, but the pros learn early on that taking care of themselves is vital to a long career. Even so, plenty of famous singers have had vocal cord surgery to remove nodules, and Robert Plant is one of the most famous examples. The information about when that surgery happened hadn't been publicized, but fans have theorized based on a noticeable change in Plant's vocals. The years 1972 and 1973 are the most common guesses, as most fans believe the quality of his vocals changed after that. They also tend to believe that he became less adventurous, shying away from the primal howls that marked much of his early work. What confuses things, though, is that Led Zeppelin's 1975 album, Physical Graffiti, contains both contemporary recordings as well as tracks that were recorded years earlier. So the answer to this mystery isn't as simple as listening to one album and comparing it to earlier work. In 1975, Led Zeppelin were poised to start a new tour and record a new album while enjoying their status as the biggest rock band in the world. They'd just come off a huge tour that had earned them plenty of money, and they had every intention of keeping that momentum going. And then came August 4th. On that day, Plant was in the passenger seat of a rented car on the Greek island of Rhodes. His wife Maureen was driving, while their children Carrick and Carmen were in the back seat with a friend. Then the car skidded off the road, sailed over a ledge, and landed in a tree. Plant shattered his right leg in several places, while Maureen ended up unconscious and bleeding. The children were also injured. It took hours for help to arrive, and when Plant finally came out of the hospital, he was in a wheelchair. Carrick had a broken leg, and Maureen had a fractured skull. It was a miracle that they all survived. A Led Zeppelin tour was out of the question, of course. The band did at least manage to rally to record their 1976 album Presence, though Plant had to lay down his vocals from a wheelchair. He also went through a bout with depression, which is reflected in the album's dark lyrics. In 1977, Led Zeppelin was a band trying to get its groove back. They'd been forced to slow down in the wake of the Plant's family car crash. Over the next 2 years, the music world changed around them with the arrival of punk rock, and their album Presence came to be regarded as a relatively minor work in their catalog. As the group embarked on a world tour, they intended to prove that they were still the biggest band in the world. Things got off to a rough start, though, when Plant lost his voice for several weeks, and tour dates had to be postponed. Zeppelin finally got on the road in April. But then on July 26, 1977, Robert Plant received 2 phone calls. The first informed him that his 5-year-old son Carrick was ill. The second call came shortly after, giving him the devastating news that Carrick had died. Just a week earlier, Plant's daughter Carmen had been sick with a stomach virus, though she'd gotten better. When Carrick fell ill, it was thought to be the same virus, but he was hit much harder. Plant left the tour and immediately flew home. Unsurprisingly, the rest of the tour was canceled. Plant has had one of the most successful careers in rock music history. Not only was he the lead singer of one of the most iconic rock bands of all time, he's also enjoyed spectacular success as a solo artist. In fact, the 4 decades of his solo work dwarfed the 12 years he spent in Led Zeppelin. So it's kind of shocking to hear that there was a time when he seriously considered leaving music behind and training to become a teacher. But that's exactly what happened in 1977 when his son Carrick passed away. As he told Louder in 2020, "I was thinking about the merit of my life at that time, and whether or not I needed to put a lot more into the reality of the people that I loved and cared for, my daughter and my family generally. So yeah, I was ready to jack it in."
Time is swallowed by every move,
In 2007, Plant told Rolling Stone, "I lost my boy. I didn't want to be in Led Zeppelin. I wanted to be with my family." Ultimately, Plant was convinced to carry on with music and Led Zeppelin by his friend, Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham. Plant and John Bonham knew each other long before they were in Led Zeppelin together. They met in 1965 when they were both just 17 years old. Over the next few years, they played in 2 bands together, the Crawling King Snakes and the Band of Joy. When Plant was offered the lead singer position for Led Zeppelin in 1968, he recommended Bonham for the drums, which allowed the 2 friends to work together on a much bigger stage. Bonham had his demons, including a propensity for alcohol. On September 24, 1980, he went to sleep after drinking heavily and choked in his sleep. Plant was devastated. In 2012, Bonham's son Jason revealed that Plant told him, "We shared something very, very special. I struggle sometimes just thinking about trying to create some magic again when he's not there. He was a very, very dear friend of mine that I miss every day." In fact, Plant's devastation over his friend's death is a big reason why Led Zeppelin have never reunited for a full tour, even though such a reunion would make headlines everywhere. In 2018, Jason Bonham told Billboard that Plant told him, "I loved your dad way too much. When your father left us, left the world, that was it for Led Zeppelin."
I thought all those years later, it was just one ridiculous loss.
Robert Plant married his wife Maureen Wilson in 1968, just as Led Zeppelin was taking off. They met in 1966, and she supported them with her nursing work when he was a struggling, unknown musician. He loved her very much, and he even dedicated the Led Zeppelin song Thank You to her. Maureen accompanied her husband on the first Led Zeppelin tour, but shortly after the birth of their first child, she began staying home with the kids while Plant toured. The singer has admitted that while he tried to be a good father and husband, he was distracted. In 2020, he told Louder, "I'd spent so much time trying to be a decent dad, but at the same time, I was really attracted to what I was doing in Zeppelin." The couple had another son, Logan, in 1979, but Plant's career continued to take its toll on their marriage. In 1983, the couple divorced. Afterwards, Plant dated around for a bit. There are rumors that he even dated Maureen's sister Shirley for a while, but he never came close to the level of commitment he'd enjoyed with Maureen, and he's never remarried. In 2010, Plant decided to reform one of his early groups, Band of Joy. He recruited some new members, including folk singer-songwriter Patty Griffin. He hired her as a backing singer, and the 2 began a relationship that proved to be very serious. In fact, he moved in with her and they lived together in Austin, Texas for several years. He also collaborated with her on the band's self-titled 2010 album. Sadly, in 2014, the couple ended their relationship and Plant moved back to England after several years in America. Griffin has refused to comment on the relationship or its ending, but it's clear that the breakup affected Plant deeply. In 2017, while talking with Louder about his 2017 solo album Carry Fire, he noted, "If you listen to the album, you can hear me pouring out my heart to whoever's interested. 'Cause that's what I do. And it's not easy to do that, believe me." Johnny Cash's life was one of breathtaking highs and unfathomable lows. Despite his legendary talent and all the respect he commanded because of it, Cash was a man who frequently succumbed to his temptations and tested the faith others had in him. This is the tragic real-life story of Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash was the fourth of 7 children, born February 26, 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, to Ray and Carrie Cash. In his memoir, Johnny Cash, the autobiography, Cash recalled that the house in which he was born didn't have any windows, and in winter, his mother had to hang blankets to keep them warm. The Depression hit the Cash family hard, but when Johnny was 3 years old, they moved to the Dias Colony in northeast Arkansas, taking part in a federal farming program in which the family farmed 20 acres of cotton and other crops. When he was 5, Johnny started working the fields alongside his parents and siblings. He started first as a water boy, carrying drinking water out to his family. By the time he was 8, he was picking cotton with them, dragging a heavy canvas sack that started empty, but by the end of the day held 200 or more pounds of cotton. Cash wrote in his memoir, "It wasn't complicated. You just parked the wagon at one end of the rows and went to it." He said the work was exhausting and painful. He had back pain, even as a child, and the cotton bolls he picked were sharp, which cut his hands. Cash remembered, "We just worked and worked and worked." One Saturday morning when Johnny Cash was 12, he asked his older brother Jack to go fishing. Jack declined, since he had a job cutting oak trees into posts and working at a table saw. In his autobiography, Cash remembers begging his brother to skip the work, but Jack said no. Cash went by himself, but the time he spent there felt listless, and eventually he left and headed for home. On his way back, his father met him on the road in a panic. There had been an accident, and Jack was badly hurt. He had been pulled into the saw and cut from his ribs through his stomach to his groin. Jack clung on to life for close to a week before finally succumbing. Cash later remembered, "After Jack's death, I felt like I'd died too. I had no other friend." As he grew up, Cash felt his brother's influence on him. Cash wrote, "The most important question in my life has been, which is Jack's way? Which direction would he have taken?" Jack even showed up in Cash's dreams from time to time. Usually when Cash was either doing something he shouldn't have been doing or about to do something he shouldn't have been doing. In the dreams, Jack would know what Cash wanted to do and would look at him with an admonishing smile. According to Cash, there's no fooling Jack. When Cash was in the Air Force, he incessantly wrote letters to a woman named Vivian Liberto, who he had met at a roller rink and would later marry after leaving the service. Their domestic situation was a relatively normal one, in the sense that he got a job and they started a family, but all that changed when Cash started playing and recording music. Cash had a hit record, Cry, 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 that compelled him to go out on tour, and that spelled trouble for their marriage. Eventually, according to biographer Steve Turner, Cash was away from home up to 80% of the year, traveling some 300,000 miles in the process. Unfortunately, during his time he also began to succumb to his addiction to amphetamines and alcohol, and also developed an eye for the attractive, sassy women he'd often meet on the road. Around this time, he also met and began flirting with June Carter, who would go on to become his second wife. Cash's time on the road made his time at home difficult to bear. His eldest daughter, Roseanne, would later remember, "It got to where it was like somebody else was coming home, not my daddy. The drugs were at work, he'd stay up all night, he and my mom would fight, it was so sad." According to another of his daughters, Cindy, Vivian would often put her children in the car and go looking for a drunken Cash around town. She finally filed for divorce in 1966, and it was granted the following year. In 1961, Cash and his wife Vivian moved with their 4 daughters to Casita Springs in Ventura County, California, where Vivian hoped he would be convinced to give up the pills and alcohol that had become an integral and dangerous part of his life. Instead, his problems got worse, particularly with amphetamines. His daughter Roseanne later said, "In my preteen years, my father's drug addiction was really consuming him and my parents' marriage. There was just this background tension and anxiety to all of those years. The pills would leave his voice a mere croak, and it got to the point where he was having trouble performing. Often, he never showed up to his gigs at all. Eventually, Cash stopped taking amphetamines, but his vigilance would sometimes wane. After all, he was still an addict and an alcoholic. He couldn't just take one pill. He needed a handful. He couldn't just have one drink. He needed to empty out his hotel room's minibar. Cash's struggles continued in the 80s when he was prescribed pain medication for various surgeries and illnesses and continued to take them after he no longer needed them. Luckily, Cash didn't face these demons alone. The singer's struggles required a steadying influence in his life, so when he couldn't manage himself, he leaned on his second wife, June.
She may have been the person responsible for me still being alive.
Strangely enough, the man who sang so convincingly about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die was never once in his life incarcerated in an actual prison. He was, however, arrested several times for a variety of offenses related to drugs, either for procuring them or for his many escapades under their influence. Steve Turner's Cash biography tells the story of October 1965, when Cash took a flight to El Paso, Texas, then caught a cab to take him across the Mexican border to Juarez, where he bought 668 Dexedrine and 475 Equinil tablets on the black market and hid them in his guitar. Unfortunately for him, the dealer was under surveillance for allegedly selling heroin. Cash was arrested at the airport and held overnight on drug smuggling charges. He also faced charges back in El Paso for possession of the pills. Earlier that year, in May, Cash was drunk and out well past curfew in Starkville, Mississippi, when police arrested him and put him in a holding cell overnight to sober up. According to Rolling Stone, Cash kicked his foot against the cell door so hard that he broke one of his toes. And in November 1967, while under the influence of pills, Cash went on a joyride through Georgia before banging on the door of a rural home until the police were summoned. His arrest that time netted him a night in jail. Cash often told a story about a time in which he was so deep in the throes of drug-related despair that he found himself completely robbed of the will to live. According to Cash, he trekked up to the Nickajack Cave in Tennessee in the fall of 1967. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Nickajack contained the remains of many cave explorers, amateur adventurers who'd lost their lives in the caves over the years, usually by losing their way, and it was my hope and intention to join their company." Cash said he crawled through the cave for several hours until his flashlight batteries gave out, at which point he laid down in the pitch dark, ready to die. He said he'd never felt so far from God, but as he laid there, an epiphany came over him, that perhaps it wasn't his time to die. He got up and found his way out of the cave in the dark, guided by a small draft of air, and subsequently promised to quit drugs that very day. Cash recounted this story many times. It's published in his memoir and in a number of magazines and books that cover his life. But the story has many detractors. For example, Marshall Grant, Cash's friend and former bass player, says it never happened. And Robert Hilburn, Cash's biographer, notes that the Nickajack Cave was underwater in the fall of 1967, since the Army Corps of Engineers had dammed it up. He also wrote, Cash did not quit drugs that day. In April 2003, June Carter Cash had been diagnosed with a leaky heart valve. And after a battery of tests, doctors determined that valve replacement surgery was the only option to fix her problem and prolong her life. According to Steve Turner's biography of her husband, she initially balked at the prospect of going under the knife, claiming that at 73, she was too old for the operation. Johnny Cash begged her to have the surgery, claiming he wasn't ready for her to leave him. June finally relented and had the surgery on May 7th, but early the next morning she went into cardiac arrest. It took doctors 20 minutes to resuscitate her, after which they put her on life support. 3 days later, doctors performed more tests to see if she responded to stimuli, an indicator of whether she had any brain function. No one was certain how long her brain had been deprived of oxygen during the cardiac episode and resuscitation efforts. Johnny Cash gave permission for life support to be switched off, and June's bodily functions were expected to shut down over the course of 3 or so hours. Instead, she lingered for 3 days. On May 15th, with her family standing vigil around her bed, June Carter Cash passed away.
We're friends, and we're sweethearts and lovers, and we're married, and we're happy.
Within 4 months of his wife June's death, Johnny Cash would also be gone, but not before doing one last bit of work. In the days immediately following June's funeral, Cash reflected on his wife's life and their time together, which added up to 35 years of marriage, with very little of that time spent apart. He tried to keep busy too. Mere days after June's funeral, Cash was back in the recording studio with legendary producer Rick Rubin, adding to the collection of songs the two had stockpiled for the American Recordings series. But his ill health continued. In his final weeks, he would be hospitalized with pancreatitis, and 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, Johnny Cash died of complications from diabetes. He was 71 years old. Cash's legacy as a singer, songwriter, song interpreter, and shaper and reshaper of country music is unquestioned. There are few figures in country whose shadow looms as large as Cash's. When he was alive, he was larger than life. But that status came at a cost. His problems loomed large too, and as he suffered, so did those around him. Still, when Johnny Cash spoke, millions listened. When he sang, millions sang along. When he died, millions mourned him. That kid who grew up poor on the cotton farm sure made a hell of an impact. It hasn't been good times all the time for Van Halen. They've endured lineup changes, the consequences of a rock and roll lifestyle, and plenty of health scares. Here are some of the most tragic moments in Van Halen's history. While Van Halen was named after brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen, their breakout star was colorful lead singer David Lee Roth. He was always good for a quippy quote, bouncing around on stage, and mugging for the cameras. But then in 1985, he left the band, a year after the release of their most successful album, 1984.
Why'd you leave?
Why did I bail? I'm a workaholic. I like to travel. I like to go on the road.
That left the rest of Van Halen scrambling to find a new lead singer to keep that gravy train rolling. Several of the band's initial choices turned down the gig, which eventually went to hard rock solo artist Sammy Hagar. Patti Smith of the band Scandal was one of those choices. She told Delaware's News Journal in 2014, "They had asked me not to talk about it in interviews at the time because they didn't want Sammy Hagar to feel like he was the second choice." Another interesting selection that could have been was the honey-voiced Daryl Hall of blue-eyed soul duo Hall & Oates. When Hagar was a guest on Hall's show Live at Daryl's House, he asked Hall about the rumor that he'd been asked to join his old band, which Hall confirmed. Not long after the stressful departure of Roth in 1985, Eddie and Alex Van Halen endured a far more taxing ordeal. Their father, Jan Van Halen, suffered a heart attack in May 1986 and then died in December of that year at the age of 66. In a 1988 profile in Rolling Stone, Eddie indicated that a problem with alcohol contributed to his father's death. His passing, as well as the time Eddie was forced to stay in the hospital for tropical fever, made him take a long, hard look at himself. As he put it, "That kind of made me look at things a little different. Imagining being in there for an OD or alcohol, like my dad died from, it kind of wised me up." Their father's death shook Alex as well, who enjoyed a reputation as the hardest partier of anyone in the band. He also quit drinking around 1986 and admitted that he didn't want to end up like The Who's Keith Moon or Led Zeppelin's John Bonham, two other legendary rock drummers who died from complications from excessive alcohol consumption. Bassist Michael Anthony's relationship with Eddie Van Halen started to suffer in the late 90s when the band parted with Sammy Hagar and briefly united with David Lee Roth. Hagar had started a new band called Planet Us and had asked Anthony if he'd like to join. Van Halen took that to mean that Anthony had quit. Flash forward to 2004, when Van Halen wanted to tour with Hagar and they asked Anthony to get the jilted singer to sign on. However, if Anthony wanted to be a part of it, he'd have to sign away his legal rights to Van Halen's band name and take a pay cut.
It's really irritating to see them go after Mikey. Mikey didn't do anything ever to Van Halen. Mikey was the most loyal guy in the band.
3 years later, Van Halen hit the road again, this time with Roth, but without Anthony, who found out about the tour when it was reported in the press. The band's newest bassist was Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's teenage son. On top of that, Eddie refuted Anthony's version of the events to Rolling Stone, saying, "When Hagar left the band, Mike went with him. Then when we get back together with Dave and all of a sudden he wants back in, it's like, no dude, you quit the band." But that wasn't how Anthony saw it. He told Music Radar in 2009 that he simply never quit Van Halen. "This is one rock and roll feud we don't expect to be settled quickly and easily." Van Halen has a reputation for being a nightmare on tour, and with that in mind, perhaps the most famous bit of Van Halen lore is the no brown M&Ms rule. The band's 1982 rider included a stipulation that their backstage bowl of M&Ms must be totally free of any brown candies. This wasn't Van Halen acting like a bunch of divas, however. In 2012, David Lee Roth explained that the band's touring show was difficult to set up in a timely manner because the crews in each town were inexperienced with assembling a massive rock and roll setup. So Roth asked his managers to place a clause in the rider banning brown M&Ms. If he spotted the candies in the bowl, it provided proof that the promoter hadn't read the rider, and the band would have to do a serious line check to make sure all of the stage equipment had been installed safely and correctly. If people didn't pay attention to the contract, that led to some bad consequences. For example, at Van Halen's 1980 show in Pueblo, Colorado, When Roth went backstage and found brown M&Ms, he absolutely destroyed the dressing room. As it turns out, he had every right to be mad that the promoters hadn't carefully read the contract. In addition to the M&Ms, the arena's shock-absorbent floor couldn't handle the weight of Van Halen's gear. Even though the floor's requirements were laid out in the rider, organizers ignored that section too, and tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage was done to the area floor. In their 70s and 80s heyday, the members of Van Halen would play a concert in the evening and then they'd go out and party afterward. Everyone, that is, except Eddie Van Halen, who would stay back in his hotel room to write songs, work on guitar riffs, and ingest copious amounts of vodka and cocaine. In 2015, he told Billboard, "I would use them for work. The blow keeps you awake and the alcohol lowers your inhibitions. I was an alcoholic and I needed alcohol to function." Of course, this sometimes backfired, as Eddie once got so wasted that he couldn't even play. His descent into addiction began at a very young age. He started drinking and smoking when he was 12. During his high school years, he would even get drunk before showing up to class. In 1988, he told Rolling Stone about the alcohol-related death of his father that led him to kicking booze, but the sobriety didn't last. By 2004, he turned into, as he told Billboard, an angry drunk. 3 years later, he checked himself into a rehabilitation center, which precluded him from attending Van Halen's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So many rock stars have married famous actresses that it feels like it just must be the natural order of things. In 1980, 20-year-old Valerie Bertinelli, at the time one of the stars of the popular sitcom One Day at a Time, met guitar master Eddie Van Halen backstage at one of his shows. The pair then married in April 1981, just 8 months after they became a couple.
Why did that feel like the right move for you back then, to get married at the age of 20 to a rock and roll star?
I was madly in love. Madly in love. I just adored him.
Unfortunately, drugs go hand in hand with rock and roll, and they were also part of this rock and roll marriage before it even started. Bertinelli revealed in her memoir, Losing It and Gaining My Life Back, that as she and Van Halen filled out a pre-marriage questionnaire sent by their wedding officiant, they were holding vials of cocaine. Not long into the marriage, both spouses started to stray. Bertinelli discovered evidence of Van Halen's infidelity when she heard him on the phone talking about how he wanted out of the marriage. She filed for divorce in 2005, 4 years after the two of them had separated. In March 1995, Van Halen hit the road for a long stretch of concerts in support of their album Balance. Eddie Van Halen nicknamed it the Ambulance Tour because both he and his brother were playing through significant pain. While Alex Van Halen ruptured 3 vertebrae in his neck and had to wear a not very rock and roll neck brace for the duration of many shows. Eddie was dealing with tremendous pain in his hip due to avascular necrosis. The guitarist delayed hip replacement surgery for years until he finally went under the knife in November 1999 when he was just 44. He got his brand new bionic from Dr. John R. Moreland, orthopedic surgeon to the Stars, who performed similar operations for Liza Minnelli and Elizabeth Taylor. Clearly, there's almost always a painful price to being an aging rock star. Eddie Van Halen was once a habitual chain smoker, and all the cigarettes he went through during recording sessions weren't exactly pleasant for his bandmates. Sammy Hagar described the situation to Ultimate Classic Rock. "I would come home midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I would stink so bad with all my long hair. Hair just absorbed cigarettes and my clothes." Van Halen eventually gave up smoking in favor of vaping, a necessary concession considering that a third of his tongue was surgically removed in 2000. The cancer also spread to his throat. In November 2019, he was briefly hospitalized for a health issue relating to the cancer, as he was suffering from abdominal pain, an adverse reaction to some of his cancer drugs. He told Billboard in 2019, "I used metal picks, they're brass and copper, which I always held in my mouth in the exact place where I got the tongue cancer. Plus, I basically live in a recording studio that's filled with electromagnetic energy." Eddie Van Halen has survived cancer, bone necrosis, and decades of heavy drinking. After slaying those potentially deadly demons, he faced another major health scare in 2012. On August 29th, a message posted to the Van Halen Facebook page read, "Eddie Van Halen underwent an emergency surgery for a severe bout of diverticulitis. No further surgeries are needed, and a full recovery is expected within 4 to 6 months. Symptoms like constant abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, fever, and constipation plagued Eddie, and severe cases require corrective surgery." That's what happened to Van Halen. Sadly, the condition got even worse for the Eruption guitarist. He spent an extra 3 weeks in the hospital after a surgery because of a few blown stitches, leading to an infection in his intestine, a portion of which had to be removed by doctors. Van Halen spent months recovering at home, forcing the cancellation of the rest of his band's 2012 tour dates. In the early 1980s, Alex Van Halen was briefly married to a woman named Valerie Kendall. Eventually, the two broke up, but that wouldn't be his only divorce. In 1984, he married Kelly Carter. Their union ended in 1996, but there were even more legal headaches to come. In 2013, ELVH Inc., the band's intellectual property company, sued Kelly Carter, or more accurately, Kelly Van Halen. Over a decade after her divorce, she was still using Van Halen as her professional last name. She started a construction, fashion, and interior design company named Kelly Van Halen, which, according to ELVH, constituted trademark infringement. The company also complained that putting the name Kelly Van Halen on a line of blankets, bathing suits, and armoires was confusingly similar to the sound, appearance, and commercial impression of Van Halen the rock band. After years of legal battles, all parties settled the matter out of court.
Joan Jett's first music teacher told her girls couldn't play rock and roll. Her first band was panned by audiences who wouldn't accept women as rock stars. Her first solo album was rejected by 23 record labels. But that didn't stop her. This is the real-life story of Joan Jett. Joan Jett was born Joan Marie Larkin on September 22, 1958 in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. She asked for and received her first guitar for Christmas when she was 13 years old and was told at her first lesson that girls can't play rock and roll. Luckily, Jett didn't listen and kept rocking. Her family soon moved to West Covina, California, and soon started going to the area's glam rock epicenter, Rodney Bingenheimer's English Disco. She changed her last name to Jett and modeled her now famous look of black leather, black eyeliner, and a black shag haircut after British rocker Suzi Quatro, who inspired her musically as well as aesthetically. Jett told Rolling Stone, "What Suzi Quatro did for me was make me realize that girls could be successful playing rock and roll. I realized that if I wanted to do that, there were probably other girls like me who probably wanted to do it too." Jett met drummer Sandy West at Rodney Bingenheimer's via producer Kim Fowley. Fowley introduced them to other musicians with the idea of forming an all-girl rock band. The Runaways' official lineup consisted of Joan, Sandy, lead guitarist Lita Ford, bassist Jackie Fox, and lead singer Cherie Currie. Joan and Kim Fowley wrote most of the Runaways songs, including the famous Cherry Bomb. In 2010, Jett explained to the Irish Times, "We wanted to be the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin. We wanted to play dirty, sweaty, sexy rock and roll. So when people told us girls couldn't play, that wasn't what they meant. They meant that girls couldn't play rock and roll because it implied sex, which means that they're in charge and owning it." But sexist magazine reviews focused on their youth, gender, and looks instead of their music.
Rolling Stone hated the Runaways.
And behind the scenes, Fowley was abusive, calling the band members, quote, dog, while he kept them on drugs and without money of their own, and encouraged the 16-year-old Cherie Currie to wear underwear on stage and pose for scantily clad photographs, comparing her to Lolita. Audiences were also abusive. Jett told the Irish Times, "It's difficult to get across to people what it's like to be spat at. After the gig, I would be dripping in spit and just put my head in my hands and cry out of sheer frustration. I just didn't get what the problem was, but I just can't back down, and being carried off was the only way you'd get me off the stage, not by scaring me off it." The Runaways released 5 albums in 4 years and toured the world. They found more respect and success overseas with #1 albums in both Australia and Japan, and a reception in Japan that Jett compared to Beatlemania. But behind the scenes, things deteriorated. According to Edgeplay, Fowley continued to mistreat band members, denying them schooling and healthcare and playing them against each other. Bassist Jackie Fox quit the band and was replaced by Vicky Blue, who was then replaced by Laurie McAllister. The Runaways played their last show on New Year's Eve 1978 in San Francisco and officially broke up in April 1979 after disagreements about their musical direction. Jett took the disillusion of her band hard. In her documentary Bad Reputation, Jett said, "How did I personally deal with the crumbling of the Runaways? I drank a lot, starting at 8 in the morning. I was angry. I didn't know how to make sense of a world that gave girls for playing guitars. But things soon turned around for Jett when she began working with producer Kenny Laguna, who would eventually become her manager. Laguna told the Tahoe Daily Tribune in 2007, "I worked with her on a film based on the Runaways' career called We're All Crazy Now and had a vision of what could be. She was fantastic, but no label would take her on. I love Joni, but never wanted to be her manager. But she became a cause." After a frightening hospitalization for a heart infection, Joan went to Europe and recorded and released a self-titled debut album. Back in the States, 23 labels rejected the album, so Laguna and Joan formed independent label Blackheart Records and released it themselves. Laguna said, "We couldn't think of anything else to do but print up records ourselves, and that's how Blackheart Records started. It was more or less Joan's idea to do it ourselves." An advertisement announcing that Jett was looking for a few good men led to the formation of the Blackhearts. The band started playing around Los Angeles and toured Europe before moving to New York. Jett told People in 1982 that she wanted a male band because forming another band with women would have been, quote, sacrilegious. Laguna's friend Neil Bogart re-released her self-titled solo Joan Jett as Bad Reputation on his new Boardwalk Records label. The album's lead single, also called Bad Reputation, remains iconic to this day. It was named the 29th best hard rock song of all time by VH1 in 2009 and serves as an answer song to Jett's critics and naysayers. But it was her next album that would make Jett an international superstar. Joan's first album with the Blackhearts, I Love Rock and Roll, came out in 1981 and was a surprise smash hit, reaching number 2 on the Billboard album chart. The title track, a cover of an Arrow song that Joan had performed live for years, became one of the best-selling singles of all time, topped the Billboard charts for 7 weeks, and was the third most popular song of 1982. The album remains Joan's most successful one, having sold 10 million copies. I Love Rock and Roll is Billboard's 56th all-time top song and is in the Grammy Hall of Fame. The song's popularity was bolstered by the constant play of its video on the newly influential and groundbreaking MTV, featuring Joan and the Blackhearts moodily swaggering and sneering through a live performance in a dive bar. The Blackhearts followed up this video with a meta one for Bad Reputation, depicting the rise to stardom that resulted from I Love Rock and Roll. Magazines that had insulted the Runaways now ran articles like Joan Jett is a very nice girl and selling records is the best revenge. 1982 also saw 2 more top 20 hits, including her cover of Crimson and Clover, which became notable for her decision to keep the pronouns and sing about loving a woman. The Blackhearts followed I Love Rock and Roll with 2 less successful albums, 1983's Album and 1984's Glorious Results of a Misspent Youth. Neither had a hit single, and the latter only limped to number 67 on the Billboard album charts. Critics weren't impressed either, with Rolling Stone writing that Album, quote, doesn't make a very strong argument for Jett as a major talent. In the 1986 album, Good Music fared even worse, only getting to number 105 on the Billboard album charts. But things turned around the next year when Jett appeared on the big screen opposite Michael J. Fox in the drama Light of Day. Critics panned her performance, but her theme song for the film, which was written by Bruce Springsteen, was a minor hit, landing at number 37 on the Billboard charts. That paved the way for her big 1988 comeback album, Up Your Alley, which included the top 10 hit I Hate Myself for Loving You, which charted at the same time as former Runaways bandmate Lita Ford's hit single, Kiss Me Deadly. But that success was short-lived. By the early 90s, the band was floundering again. Blackheart's drummer Tommy Price said that touring had become a grind. We were doing all of these one-off shows. We'd be going to crappy little towns doing a state fair. I went through a phase where I didn't really give a crap because they were gigs I felt like we shouldn't be doing. Jett didn't feel the same way, though.
It's always a different audience. You never know really what to expect, so you never really get bored, ever.
Though commercial success eluded Jett, artistically the decade led to a new creative flowering, as a resurgence of interest in punk led to the rise of grunge and the Riot Girl movements. After her record deal ended, Jett and producer Kenny Laguna regained creative control, and Jett began working with L7, calling the first time she saw the band live a, quote, religious experience. She also worked with Bikini Kill and recorded an album with the punk band The Gits after the murder of their lead singer Mia Zapata, with proceeds from the album and tour going to the murder investigation. Jett's sexuality has been a subject of discussion and conjecture throughout her career. She has never officially come out, yet has been an LGBTQIA+ icon for most of her time in the spotlight. In Edgeplay, Cherie Currie revealed that she and Joan had been romantically involved during The Runaways. Their relationship is also part of the plot of the 2010 movie The Runaways, which was executive produced by Jett. When asked about her sexuality, Jett told Rolling Stone she was, quote, all-inclusive and told Out that fans should go ahead and, quote, assume away. When her documentary Bad Reputation screened at the LGBTQ film festival Outfest, though, some members of the community questioned its inclusion since Jett wasn't technically out. Jett responded to the criticism, telling the New York Times, "The more you want me to say it, the more I won't say it. I'll just do it. I'm telling my story every day on stage, loud. And if you choose not to hear it because you want me to do it in the way you want me to do it, fine. I'm not going to make you happy then. If this isn't for you, bye. But I think I declare every day, all day long. You know what I say? Eat me." Despite her love of and pride in The Runaways, Jett didn't appear in Vicky Blue's 2004 documentary Edgeplay, a film about the Runaways, and refused to let them use any songs she had written. Of the film, which included allegations about manager Kim Fowley's behavior, Jett told the Montreal Mirror, "If there's going to be a Runaways movie, it should be about what we accomplished, the tours we did, the bands we played with, the people we inspired. I'm not going to participate in a Jerry Springer fest, bottom line." After Kim Fowley died in 2015, Jackie Fox came forward and revealed to the Huffington Post that he had a history of grooming young girls and that he had publicly raped her when she was in the Runaways while other band members, including Jett, watched but did not intervene. Through a representative, Jett denied any knowledge of the incident. She told the New York Times, "If he hurt people, that's not good. It's hard for me to listen to that, but I can't really speak to what they're saying." There's no question that Joan Jett has earned her place as an icon, and she's still going strong from playing the Warped Tour in 2006 to producing films like The Runaways and Bad Reputation to making social distance music videos during the COVID quarantine. Entrepreneur, film producer, rocker, and fashion icon, Joan Jett's career is a testament to her ability to keep working and stay true to herself and her vision in the face of hardship and failure. In 2015, she was honored with the rest of the Blackhearts and Kenny Laguna with an induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In the Blackhearts Hall of Fame essay, writer Jan Ulzinski called her the last American rock star pursuing her considerable craft for the right reasons, a devotion to the true spirit of the music. Anyone in Motley Crue will tell you that hard rocking comes with the side order of hard partying, and Nikki Sixx was probably one of the hardest members in any Motley Crue party. His life wasn't all roses, though. Here's the tragic story of Nikki Sixx. Before he became Nikki Sixx, young Frank Ferrana Jr. had quite a childhood, and it turned him into a hellraiser of an adult. Sixx was raised jointly by his grandparents and his mother, and had to move a lot. In a span of 11 years, he attended 7 schools. This turbulence did not mold him into a particularly law-abiding young man, and when he was living with his grandparents in Jerome, Idaho, his school expelled him for selling drugs. This was the last straw for Grandpa and Grandma Sixx, who sent the young man to his mother in Seattle.
What am I gonna do in Seattle?
According to Blabbermouth, living with his mother was no picnic for Sixx, as it came with a side order of violent men. By the time he was 17, the budding musician finally had enough, so he left his past behind and took his bass, his new name, and his big dreams to Los Angeles. Still, his experiences as a young man may have influenced Motley Crue's music. Sixx has said that the song Livewire in particular is about domestic violence and specifically mentions the assorted stepdads he had to deal with. Nikki Sixx and his mother have always had a strained relationship, and by strained we mean utterly dysfunctional. According to The Guardian, their troubles started when Sixx was just 6 years old and his mother called her parents to come and take the young boy away, allegedly telling her son, "I'm going to lock the door and I'll just leave you in the porch." Then she cruised away with the strange man. Sixx says the moment broke him and he could never truly reconnect with her again. This isn't one of those tales where time heals the wounds and the mother and son eventually reconcile either. The relationship remained so sour that reconciliation was impossible, and when she died in 2013, Sixx only acknowledged the event with a simple, dispassionate tweet. He had been fully aware of her condition, but felt that even at the brink of death, she didn't deserve any attention from him. Nikki Sixx was a particularly enthusiastic drug user during the band's glory days, so he's had more than his share of close calls. Still, none of them can hold a candle to December 23, 1987, the day he died. Ultimate Classic Rock says that after a night of hard partying with some hard-rocking friends, including members of Guns N' Roses and Rat, the festivities were slowly winding down. However, Sixx decided to treat himself to one last hit before bedtime. This proved to be a fatal mistake because he passed out and started turning blue. Paramedics arrived, but it looked like they couldn't do anything to save the bassist. Sixx was loaded in an ambulance and given shots of adrenaline, but he was already dead, or so it seemed. Hours later, he unexpectedly awoke at a hospital, cursed at a cop trying to ask him questions, and wandered out, wearing nothing but leather pants. He got a ride home and a lecture about drugs from two fans who had just heard on the radio that he had died. Sixx has described dying as a fairly typical out-of-body experience, and he's also said that death just hurts. Unfortunately, even death wasn't enough for him to break the drug habit.
I stopped for about 3 hours.
To illustrate how out of it Nikki Sixx was during the late 1980s, look no further than the train incident during Motley Crue's tour in Japan. Ultimate Classic Rock reports they took a bullet train from Tokyo to Osaka for a concert, but as it turned out, it was not a good idea to put the world's most dangerous rock band on the same train as mere mortals. During the return trip, Sixx was out of his mind while Mick Mars was busy swimming in a bottle of Jack Daniels. The two started to get on each other's nerves, and Sixx started throwing donuts at Mars. After a bit of that, the bassist decided to graduate to throwing bottles and misjudged a toss and hit a random man in the head.
And it goes to the front and smashes the window and comes crashing down on these nice little Japanese people.
When the train arrived in Tokyo, a couple of hundred cops were waiting in riot gear. They arrested Sixx and the band's manager, who both spent hours in jail while a local promoter tried to resolve the issue. Somehow, he managed to persuade the police to release them on the condition that Sixx write a letter of apology. During his worst heroin abuse years, Nikki Sixx had near-death experiences and went through pretty much all imaginable terrors that come with drug addiction. Still, he doesn't consider any of his assorted dramatic drug-using incidents as his rock bottom. For Sixx, his absolute lowest point was a fairly uneventful and intimate moment that only registered as an absolute darkest hour because he finally realized the hopelessness of his situation. According to The Fix, the realization came when his dealer was temporarily out of stock and he had no access to heroin. The bassist spent a day and a half without heroin in terrible, painful withdrawal that he likens to hell before his dealer was able to come over and resupply his addiction. This incident made Sixx realize he couldn't get out, and that information hit him so hard that he describes the sensation as an almost physical feeling of being stuck. It's easy to assume that Nikki Sixx is always going to be the most debauched person in any given relationship, but he once met his match in a pop star known as Vanity. She was a model, actress, and singer who was originally discovered, mentored, and dated by none other than Prince. By the time she met Sixx, her career was already dwindling. The two shared a mutual love of drugs and got engaged in 1987. This was not a good move, as both of them were extremely fond of rock star excesses and enabled each other's bad behavior. They would stay up all night, and in the morning, Sixx would throw Vanity out because she started acting too crazy for him. Vanity eventually moved on from her famous fiancé. She continued her hard-partying ways until 1994, when a massive overdose caused a renal failure that nearly killed her. After that, she abandoned her stage name and became a Christian evangelist under her real name, Denise Matthews. Unfortunately, her years of abuse had wrecked her health beyond repair, and she died at age 57 in 2016. A marriage to a young, restless Motley Crue member doesn't come with much stability and security, and Nikki Sixx has the divorces to prove it. Although he's a dedicated family man these days, the bass man had to trudge through 2 failed marriages to get there. According to heavy metal site Blabbermouth, his second marriage to Donna D'Errico ended in 2007. The divorce proceedings turned nasty when Sixx testified that he had discovered that she had previously been a stripper and even done some high-end call girl work. This sordid past thoroughly freaked out noted saint Nikki Sixx, according to Nikki Sixx. D'Errico's lawyers, on the other hand, dismissed his claims as little more than an amusing attempt at character assassination.
I have a strict policy against mixing business with pleasure. Are we clear on that?
The fate of Brandy Brandt, the musician's first wife and the mother of 3 of his children, was less amusing. Biography says her 7-year marriage to Sixx ended in 1996, and perhaps not coincidentally, Sixx married D'Errico just 1 month later. Brandt's life then took a very dark and strange turn. The Sydney Morning Herald says the former Playboy cover girl became involved in a large cocaine smuggling conspiracy, and she was sentenced to several years in prison in 2014. Nikki Sixx has tons of opinions and a history of substance abuse issues, and he has carved out a career in a field full of people with similar temperaments and preferences. As such, Sixx seems to attract and cultivate feuds like a gardener might nurture fine flowers. According to rock music site Loudwire, the Motley Crue bassist has varying levels of beef with Michael Sweet of Stryper, the band Kiss, and Gene Simmons in particular. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, Sebastian Bach of Skid Row fame says he can't even keep up with all the feuds Sixx has going. The Crue bassist's most long-term target is none other than Metallica. According to Loaded Radio, the two bands have been at odds since they rose to dominate their respective metal scenes at the same time in the same general area. And Sixx has been known to take potshots at the band's drummer Lars Ulrich for his appearance, attitudes, and drumming ability. Of course, this could just be because Sixx likes to annoy drummers. After all, even his own percussionist isn't safe from his inflammatory antics. According to Metal Injection, Tommy Lee says Sixx unfollowed him on Twitter immediately after Motley Crue's final show. The Star describes how, at the height of Motley Crue's fame, Nikki Sixx spent many a long night in a way you'd never expect a rock star to. Instead of drowning his worries in a mountain of groupies and fast cars, the bass player curled up in a cold, damp closet with drugs and a shotgun. According to the AV Club, the reason for his behavior was paranoia. Sixx was certain the cops were coming to get him, and the fact that he reacted to the imminent presence of law enforcement by getting as wasted as humanly possible and arming himself shows just how out of it he was at the time. During his worst moments of heroin addiction, this was actually closer to his status quo than all the happy-go-lucky partying and gleeful depravity described in The Dirt. His own memoir, The Heroin Diaries, functions largely as a document of this awful dark side of the rock star lifestyle. 1988 was perhaps the most infamous year for Motley Crue and Nikki Sixx. The peak of both their popularity and the bassist's heroin addiction, that year was full of rowdiness, health scares, canceled concerts, and trouble with the law. On top of all this chaos, a man named Matthew Tripp emerged with a strange story. Music site Louder says Tripp was a relatively unknown musician who claimed he had a secret history as the bass player for Crue. Not a new member, mind you. He said he literally spent a year as Nikki Sixx. According to Tripp, Sixx was sidelined due to a nasty car accident in 1982. He says guitarist Mick Mars recruited the similar-looking Tripp to take over the bass responsibilities in 1983, starting a gig as Nikki Sixx 2.0 that ended in 1984 when Tripp was involved in an armed robbery. As he was waiting for his trial, the real Sixx rejoined the band, and they went on to record songs that Tripp claims he wrote, such as Save Our Souls. Of course, Tripp's tales turned out to be pretty tall. Although he does seem to have believed the whole thing himself, he still managed to keep a lawsuit against the band's manager going for a few years, and the bogus story received some significant publicity. Nikki Sixx has been open about the fact that he struggled with depression in his youth, and he says taking drugs was partially an attempt to self-medicate the condition. He takes depression very seriously to the point that he even included its medical definition in the glossary of the Heroin Diaries. Still, his most public foray at addressing the subject was actually prompted by Gene Simmons. In 2014, the Kiss ringleader made some controversial comments about depression, dismissing its validity as a mental disorder and saying that people who claim they're depressed should just take their lives. This was a colossally stupid comment, and Sixx immediately jumped in the fray. According to Rolling Stone, the Motley Crue man labeled Simmons' comments moronic and pointed out that some kid might actually hear his words and believe that suicide is the only way out. Sixx then went on to carefully explain that there are many, many ways out of depression, and the last thing any depressed person should have to do is hear some rock star claiming that there is only one final way to deal with the situation. It's probably not a coincidence that Simmons released a swift and uncharacteristically humble apology.
Ever since she first stepped into the spotlight, Tina Turner has enjoyed the highest highs stardom has to offer, and suffered the lowest of lows, too. From her difficult childhood to her horrific marriage to the very end of her singing career, this is the tragic real-life story of Tina Turner. Anna Mae Bullock grew up in Nutbush, Tennessee as the daughter of two sharecroppers, Floyd and Zelma Bullock. When Anna, later Tina, was 10 years old, her mother left her family and her home in search of a better life for herself. Tina's dad eventually split as well, forcing her to grow up quickly. During this time, she and her older sister Aline were raised by their grandmother, and when she died, they made their way to St. Louis, where her estranged mother had settled. But these were just the beginnings of the hard times for the little girl who would grow up to become one of the best-selling recording artists in the world. While living in St. Louis, Tina and her sister would frequent R&B clubs in the area. It was during a night out at Club Manhattan that she met the man who would come to cause her so much distress and pain, Ike Turner. Tina's own sister Aline was the one responsible for introducing Tina to Ike Turner. Aline was a barmaid at a popular R&B club in St. Louis, where Ike Turner's band, the Kings of Rhythm, would regularly perform. One night, while Tina was watching the band, the drummer put a mic in front of her, and she started to join in. Later, Ike ran over saying, "Girl, I didn't know you could sing." In a 1986 interview with Rolling Stone, Tina explains that everyone was happy for her because they had heard so many stories from her sister about Tina wanting to be a singer. And from that night on, she was. Ike started giving Tina clothes and jewelry to wear for performances, already doing his best to mold her into what he expected her to be. Tina, on the other hand, didn't want anything to do with him at first. She later told Rolling Stone, "I thought he was terribly ugly." Although she had been born Anna Mae Bullock, Ike Turner soon decided that his new partner's name wasn't flashy enough. While recording his first demo, which featured Tina heavily, he decided they needed to come up with a name. And that's when the Ike and Tina Turner review came to be. In a 2013 interview with Oprah, Tina admitted that Ike was clever in changing her name because then he would essentially own her.
If I ran away, Tina was his name. It was patent, as you call it. So he could own you. So he could own me. Are you smart?
Ike made a point of attaching his name to hers for future recordings, too, because he'd had experiences in the past where he'd produced people to the point of fame, only for them to score record deals by themselves and leave. He wanted to do all he could to hitch a ride on her star, and he was prepared to go to drastic measures in order to do so. From the sounds of it, Ike and Tina Turner's marriage was doomed from the very beginning. In Tina Turner's 2018 memoir, My Love Story, she opens up about her ill-fated marriage to Ike Turner in 1962. According to Tina, she accompanied Ike to Tijuana, Mexico for a quick wedding at the age of 22. A far cry from her ideal wedding scenario, she went along with his plans in an effort to placate him and avoid further abuse. Following the ceremony, the couple spent their first few hours as newlyweds attending a live show at a brothel. That was obviously not where she wanted to be, of course. Tina describes her wedding night as being a miserable experience that left her on the verge of tears. In a later interview, she said, "The experience was so disturbing that I suppressed it, scratched it out, and created a different scenario, a fantasy of romantic elopement." Tina kept the more perverse details of her marriage a secret for many years out of nothing less than sheer embarrassment. In a 2013 interview with Oprah, Tina Turner described the first time her husband Ike ever beat her. According to Turner, she had expressed concerns about tying her name to his as a musical partner to a colleague of his. And when word got back to Ike about it, he told Tina that he wanted to speak with her. He started out by questioning what Tina was trying to do to him, and then he picked up a wooden shoe stretcher and beat her across the head with it.
You know, if you play guitar, you can't fight and play the guitar, so you always fought with something.
And the abuse didn't stop there. In Tina's memoir, she alleges that Ike Turner was merciless in his beatings, going so far as to throw hot coffee in her face, resulting in third-degree burns and even breaking her jaw at one point. In the end, the pressures of her horrific marriage became too much to bear. In My Love Story, Tina Turner shockingly reveals that she was at such a loss during her marriage to Ike and so morbidly depressed that at one point she attempted to take her own life. Tina went to the doctor and claimed she was having trouble sleeping, so he would prescribe her pills for it. That night, she took 50 of them with the intent to end her suffering with Ike and her troubled life as a whole. She also describes her attempt as being far more than a classic cry for help and that she truly wanted to die. Tina goes on to say in her memoir that she was unhappy when she woke up, but walked away from the experience believing it was a sign that she was meant to be alive. She never attempted suicide again. Of course, her husband Ike offered no words of consolation after the event. When Tina woke up in the hospital after recovering from the overdose, Ike simply told her that she should have died. In 1976, Tina Turner fled Ike Turner with nothing more than 36 cents and a gas card in her pocket. In a 2019 profile by the New York Times, the singer reveals that she was swollen from beatings, in debt, and didn't even take her wigs with her. She just up and left. She stopped in the first safe hotel she could find and pled with the manager there to give her a room, which he did. Ike and Tina were in the middle of touring when she finally got up the courage to leave him, and although she was relieved to finally be free, it wasn't all that easy at first. A good number of promoters tried to sue to recoup expenses and ticket sales, and Ike himself retaliated. According to her memoir, Tina says that once she filed for divorce, Ike would send his stooges to intimidate her. One night, according to Tina, they went so far as to shoot bullets into the house she had relocated to. She would get so scared, in fact, that on some nights she'd be forced to sleep in a closet. In a 1985 Spin magazine feature, Ike Turner was flippant at best when asked to respond to the long-running story that he had beaten Tina during their marriage. He explained, "It's years ago that I had a temper. I don't regret nothing I've ever done, absolutely nothing. Yeah, I hit her, but I didn't hit her more than the average guy beats his wife." Ike repeatedly allowed his true personality to reveal itself during that Spin interview. First by bragging that he was personally responsible for making Tina into a sex symbol by styling her that way, and then by admitting she was right to think he was sleeping around on her, because he definitely was. In 2007, Ike Turner was found dead at his home in California, having died due to what was later ruled a cocaine overdose. He was 76 years old. In response to his passing, a representative for Tina issued the statement, "Tina hasn't had any contact with Ike in more than 30 years. No further comment will be made." In her 2019 profile by the New York Times, Tina said she wasn't sure if she could ever forgive everything that Ike ever did to her. But she also pointed out that he's dead, so she doesn't really have to worry about him anymore. That's a sentiment that many thought she had reconsidered when the Tina Turner musical debuted in London in 2018, and she walked on stage during the curtain call to tell the actor portraying her abusive ex-husband that she forgives him. Still, Tina has fluctuated on her forgiveness towards Ike in the recent past. In a 2018 interview with People magazine, Tina said that as an old person, she does forgive him, but that Ike was the type of person you could never forgive and let back in. She went on to say in that same interview that it's all gone, all forgotten. As you'd expect with a star as bright as Tina Turner, it can sometimes become a little difficult to share the stage with someone else, especially when there are egos involved. In Elton John's autobiography, Me, published in 2019, the legendary singer spills the details of a feud between he and Tina Turner dating back to 1997. Apparently, the two had been planning a joint tour, but that all went up in flames when Tina allegedly called him on the phone to berate him about his piano playing, his clothes, and a number of other grievances. Tina apparently said, "You wear too much Versace and it makes you look fat." He went on to dish that during rehearsals for the tour that would never be, Tina was rude to his band and to him, accusing him of playing her classic hit Proud Mary incorrectly. Other sources, such as the New York Post, have also suggested the two had an ongoing feud. Apparently, Elton and Tina had it out during another rehearsal, this time for VH1's Divas Live 99. This particular rift was again caused by Tina taking issue with Elton's piano playing. In 2009, Tina Turner toured the world on her 50th anniversary tour, ending with a final date at Sheffield Arena on May 5, 2009, after which she retired from performing. The final song played that night was Be Tender With Me Baby off of her album Foreign Affair, which was released in 1989. The tour was her first tour in 8 years and is said to have grossed $130 million. After that, however, she was done for good.
Me, Irvin, and my cook got on the plane, and I took a deep breath and I said, "This is it. I'm not going back for anything."
Tina had been singing since her 20s, right up until she was 70 years old, and according to her, had enjoyed no personal life to speak of outside of the showbiz world. In 2013, Tina Turner married again, this time to Irvin Bach, a German music executive. The couple knew each other for a long time prior to getting married, having originally met in 1985 at a record label party in London. In 1994, they moved together to Switzerland, and Tina eventually applied to become a Swiss citizen, giving up her American passport. Unfortunately, Tina suffered a stroke just 3 weeks after their marriage, which rendered her unable to walk. She got through that, however, learning how to walk all over again, only to learn in 2016 that she was suffering from intestinal cancer. Turning down standard medical treatments in favor of homeopathic remedies turned out to be a bad choice, and eventually Tina suffered total kidney failure. In desperate need of a kidney replacement, her new husband stepped in as a donor.
Ozzy Osbourne has seen it all, and a lot of it has been surprisingly awful, actually. Although Ozzy has been both a world-famous vocalist and a reality show dad, that doesn't mean his life was ever easy. Here's the tragic real-life story of Ozzy Osbourne. In 2002, Osbourne revealed in an interview with London's Daily Mirror that he was abused when he was a child. According to the singer, when he was an 11-year-old schoolboy in Birmingham, 2 bullies would frequently intercept him on the way home from school and subject him to all sorts of harm. They routinely forced him to drop his pants and do other things Osbourne has refrained from describing in detail, only summing the treatment up as being, quote, terrible. The effect the abuse has had on Osbourne's family life as a child was even worse. As he recalled, the first time the bullies hit him took place in front of his sister, and he was too afraid to tell his parents what had happened. The stressful situation didn't do any favors for his mental health, and Ozzy had been open about how damaging the experience was. Because of these past traumas, he says he's made a point of telling his own children to never be afraid to speak up about pain or abuse they may be going through. The rest of Ozzy's childhood wasn't easy either. At one point, he felt so desperate that he even considered ending his own life. According to the Osbourne biography Ozzy Unauthorized, the future Black Sabbath vocalist attempted to hang himself at the age of 14. Luckily, this wasn't the end of his story, as Osbourne's father caught him in the act and intervened. Less fortunately, the elder Osbourne then reportedly proceeded to beat his son up for the trouble. Not exactly the kind of support system most kids need. As far as marriages go, Ozzy is mostly known for his relationship with Sharon, and that's rarely looked like an exactly functional relationship. But while Ozzy's behavior towards Sharon has occasionally caused some serious concern, his treatment of his first wife, Thelma Riley, might actually have been worse. According to the Birmingham Mail, Osbourne is still ashamed, saying, "I put that woman through hell. I should have never married her. She didn't deserve it. She wasn't a bad person, and she wasn't a bad wife. But I was a nightmare." Osbourne married Riley in 1971 and spent the vast majority of their time together living like what he called a married bachelor. He was often absent and routinely neglected and cheated on Riley. Osbourne has recalled one particular incident in California when he got off the phone with her and then proceeded to go to bed with 3 groupies.
You know, when I first started playing rock music, I encountered this big country America, and it was like availability was there, and we all went, they did the groupies thing.
He also noted that discovering cocaine during their marriage didn't help matters. Overall, he feels that the way he treated Riley is one of his few true regrets. No one likes getting fired from their dream job, and Ozzy Osbourne was no exception. The summer of 1978 was a chaotic time for Black Sabbath. They were fueled by alcohol and cocaine, and the bad reviews of 1976's Technical Ecstasy and 1978's Never Say Die were apparently getting to them. It didn't help that the young, energetic band they were touring with, Van Halen, was frequently outperforming them. Something needed to change. With his collection of childhood traumas and abuse, Osbourne's self-worth was intertwined with the success of the band. A couple years of poor reviews were enough to destroy his confidence. He dove into a pit of drugs and booze and kept making excuses to his bandmates. The others kept trying to get their lead singer back on track, but ultimately, they had no choice but to fire him in 1979. They have since reunited, but Osbourne still considers it an act of betrayal. Though he admits that he was wasted, he feels it was hypocritical to fire him since, according to him, the others were all almost as out of it as he was. Few people expected Osbourne to bounce back as quickly as he did. As Rolling Stone reports, by 1982, he was an established performer with 2 successful solo albums under his belt. A huge part of his solo success was his new musical partner, guitar virtuoso Randy Rhoads. The guitarist's flashy style helped Osbourne express his own ideas, and the two became fast friends. Their partnership was cut tragically short on March 19, 1982, when the 25-year-old Rhoads died in a plane crash in Leesburg, Florida. Reportedly, Rhoads went on a joyride in a small Beechcraft Bonanza with the band's bus driver, Andrew Aycock, who commandeered the plane without permission. The plane buzzed the band's tour bus, and on the 3rd pass, the plane clipped the vehicle and spun out of control. All 3 passengers died in a fiery crash. The explosion rattled Osbourne awake, and he clambered out to see the flaming wreck. The singer has said that he sometimes feels as though he's still standing on that field, staring at the burning crash site. In one frightening incident in 1989, Ozzy allegedly walked up to his wife Sharon in a drunken stupor and tried to strangle her. Fortunately, they weren't alone. The attempt was stopped, the cops were called, and Ozzy did not succeed in his bizarre and violent mission.
He just said, "We've made a decision," and I'm like, "We've?" "Yes, and you've got to die."
In a 2007 interview with the Evening Standard, Ozzy recounted the horror of waking up in a small cell, walls smeared with human feces, having no recollection of the previous night. He faced his worst nightmare when an officer informed him that he had been locked up for attempting to kill his wife. A court-mandated separation and rehab stint helped the couple end up staying together, but neither has forgotten just how terrifyingly wrong things could have gone. Speaking about domestic violence in 2004, Sharon said the situation was so serious that if she'd had a gun with her at the time of Ozzy's attack, she would have shot her husband in self-defense. According to People, Sharon Osbourne says she knows of 6 women her husband has cheated with, from teenage fans to masseuses and even their own household staff. Channel 24 describes one of the more recent incidents where Osbourne accidentally sent his wife a message that he meant for another woman. Things got so bad that Sharon at one point dosed her husband with extra sleeping pills to make him tell her the truth about his cheating. 6 months after Ozzy swore that things were over with that particular lover, Sharon discovered both that this was a lie and that there were other women as well. This reveal forced the musician to finally admit he had a problem, and he has since sought treatment. Although the two seem to have reconciled, their love life is still an issue.
This is a bone of contention in our house. Really? Oh, because he's got a problem.
Ozzy Osbourne has been alleged to, at various points in his life, abuse cocaine, heroin, marijuana, Quaaludes, glue, cough syrup, Rohypnol, Klonopin, Vicodin, LSD, sleeping pills, and more, often at the same time, and with massive amounts of alcohol. How has he survived all that? One possible reason may be his peculiar genetic makeup, which features a few minor mutations in the way he processes drugs, and also some Neanderthal DNA to mix things up. Ironically, his genetic makeup also shows that the one substance that affects him particularly strongly is caffeine, of all things. But not even genetic freaks with a dash of caveman could keep up with Ozzy Osbourne levels of intake forever. The singer has been a recovering addict since 2006 and has said that he deeply regrets his worst blackout years.
What would you give the 21-year-old Ozzy? What advice would you give you?
Don't do drugs.
On December 8, 2003, Ozzy Osbourne suffered a terrifying injury at his home when he unintentionally flipped his quad bike and it landed on him. At the time of the incident, Ozzy was reported to have been under the influence of a heavy dosage of prescription drugs, which may have played a part in what happened. Osbourne broke his collarbone, damaged a vertebrae in his neck, and fractured 8 ribs, some of which were left pinching major blood vessels. Osbourne told People that the accident was so serious that he, quote, died twice, and the only reason he survived was because his bodyguard managed to repeatedly revive him. Osbourne spent 8 days in a coma and was left with a piece of metal keeping his left shoulder together. He says he's extremely lucky not to be paralyzed and even luckier to be alive. Ozzy isn't the only Osbourne with personal issues. Sharon Osbourne has struggled with low self-esteem and body image concerns that have reportedly led to bouts of bulimia. She was also diagnosed with colon cancer in 2002, and although she was ultimately victorious in beating the disease, her husband has expressed that at the time, he felt absolutely certain that his wife was going to die. The younger family members from the reality TV hit The Osbournes have also had their share of difficulties. According to People, Kelly Osbourne first encountered drugs at the age of 13, and her intake was so excessive that her mother once committed her to a mental institution for 3 days in an attempt to scare her sober. Her brother Jack Osbourne was also treated for painkiller addiction when he was only 17. Thanks to the runaway success of The Osbournes, it's easy to forget that Ozzy has children who weren't regulars on the show. Some of them have had their own share of difficulties. Osbourne's eldest son, Louis, who made the occasional appearance on the reality show, is actually from the singer's first marriage with Thelma Riley. According to the Birmingham Mail, he's a musician himself, but the son is less successful than his global superstar father. The struggling Louis was forced to declare bankruptcy in 2013 when a property crash hit him hard. Amy Osbourne, the eldest daughter of Sharon and Ozzy, says she refused to take part in the reality show. 19 years old when the show first aired, she moved out of the family's house to avoid being filmed, which broke her mother's heart.
I felt if I would have stayed with the Osbournes and done the whole Osbourne thing, I felt as though maybe I would have been typecasted right away before I had a chance to experience other things.
Amy spent the following years as the rarely seen so-called reclusive Osbourne, battling depression and later dabbling in acting and music. These days, she gets along with her parents quite well, but her relationship with her siblings is reportedly still strained. In 1984, 19-year-old Ozzy Osbourne fan John Daniel McCullum took his own life. His parents promptly sued Osbourne, claiming one of his songs led to their son's death. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, the parents described McCullum as a well-adjusted kid who showed no signs of depression, but his life changed in just 6 hours. He spent some of those hours listening to Osbourne's 1980 solo debut, Blizzard of Oz, which includes the song Suicide Solution. He was allegedly discovered still wearing his headphones. While Osbourne has said that he understood the parents' grief, he disagreed with their decision to blame him for their son's death, especially because Suicide Solution doesn't actually tell listeners to take their own lives. The word solution instead refers to a liquid, and the lyrics are about the dangers of alcoholism. The case was dismissed in 1988 on the grounds that McCollum's death was not a foreseeable result of the song. Later that year, another family unsuccessfully sued Osbourne, claiming that subliminal messages in the song had caused their son's death too.
As both a legendary solo artist and a member of the rock group Fleetwood Mac, Stevie Nicks has lived hard and fast in her 5-decade career, for better or for worse. And it's fair to say things haven't always been easy. Here are the tragic details about Stevie Nicks. Stephanie Lynn Nicks was born in Phoenix in 1948 to Jess, a corporate executive, and Barbara, a homemaker. Nicks' grandpa, Aaron Nicks, was an aspiring country music singer who taught her to sing at the age of 4, built a guitar for her, and began taking her with him to local music gigs. Following a successful tap dance performance in the 6th grade, Nicks decided she wanted to be a performer. Then, while attending high school, she met a boy, a high school classmate and fellow musician named Lindsey Buckingham, who was playing at a party Nicks went to in 1966. On a whim, Nicks began singing as Buckingham played. The two didn't see each other again for 2 years, until one day, Buckingham called out of the blue and asked Nicks to join his band. The group was called Fritz, and Nicks was a welcome addition. She also fell in love with Buckingham, and the duo remained together as Fritz and opened for a number of iconic musicians, including Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Santana, before breaking up in 1971. Nicks and Buckingham, however, remained together and formed their own band, Buckingham Nicks. Within 2 years, Buckingham Nicks was signed by Polydor Records. Their debut, self-titled album came out in 1973 and went largely unnoticed by both critics and the public, except for one thing. On the album cover, the couple appeared nude from the waist up, a daring move that had never been done before. But this decision by Buckingham Nicks didn't fall into place all that easily. According to Gold Dust Woman, a biography of Nicks, Nicks demurred when asked to take off her blouse, and the abusive Buckingham threw a fit, insisting that the cover was art and lambasting Nicks for acting like a child. Nicks gave in and later hid the album, refusing to show it to her father. Unfortunately, Buckingham Nicks didn't work out all that well. Following the virtual failure of the album, the couple began to struggle financially. Buckingham continued working on his music, but Nicks worked at a variety of jobs to keep the couple afloat, including as a dental assistant, maid, and waitress. In 1994, Nicks told the Island Ear, "I worked at the Copper Penny, Clementine's, and Bob's Big Boy. I supported Lindsey and I for years." In 1975, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham finally got their due. They were asked to join Fleetwood Mac. Mick Fleetwood called the couple on New Year's Eve and asked them to dinner, but they were already working on their second album, and Buckingham wasn't too excited about the idea of joining another band. Nicks was unsure as well, since Christine McVie was already playing with Fleetwood Mac alongside her husband, John. Nicks later told Rolling Stone, "At the beginning, people said, 'Does Christine want another girl in the band?' And I said, 'I hope she does. When she meets me, I hope she likes me.'" McVie did indeed like Stevie Nicks, and both Nicks and Buckingham joined Fleetwood Mac almost immediately.
Everybody just sort of hugged each other and said, well, rehearsal is next week at 7 o'clock, and it was done.
Together, the ladies made a pact, said Nicks, to never be treated like second-class citizens. Nicks later recalled that they agreed, "We will never be not allowed to hang out in a room full of intelligent, crazy rock and roll stars, because we're just as crazy and just as intelligent as they are." Luckily, things worked out, and the band was thrilled with Stevie Nicks' songs. 2 of them, Rhiannon and Landslide, appeared on Fleetwood Mac's first album with Buckingham and Nicks, making the Billboard 200 list in 1976 with 3 hits in the top 20. As Fleetwood Mac skyrocketed to fame, however, the band members themselves weren't doing so hot. Nicks had long been frustrated about the old days, in which she worked as a waitress while Buckingham turned down $500 gigs at steakhouses. Naturally, she hoped for a better relationship with Fleetwood Mac, so she insisted to Buckingham that they had to repair their relationship and put their problems behind them. Things weren't helped, however, by the fact that Nicks began having an ill-fated affair with Mick Fleetwood. She and Buckingham broke up. Elsewhere in the band, the McVies were going through their own troubles after Christine had an affair with the lighting director in 1976. Despite the fragmented nature of the band in the late 70s, however, it was during this era that they put out arguably their greatest album ever, Rumors. Notably, a significant number of songs from Rumors can be seen as obvious preludes to the band members' impending romantic breakups, including Buckingham's Secondhand News and Never Going Back Again, and Christine McVie's You Make Loving Fun, which was written about her affair. So, as Rumors took off to become #1 on Billboard and won a Grammy for Album of the Year, the players themselves were falling apart. Stevie Nicks' newfound romantic freedom led to a number of relationships beginning in the late 70s. She first romanced the Eagles frontman, Don Henley. Nicks' 1981 debut solo album, Belladonna, featured Henley on one of the tracks, the ever-romantic Leather and Lace. But although it was rumored that Henley wanted to marry Nicks, the couple eventually broke up. A decade or so later, in 1992, Nicks told Vox magazine that she had once been pregnant by Henley, one of 4 times total she had become pregnant in her life. Nicks decided to terminate her pregnancies. She explained, "To give up 4 babies is to give up a lot that would be here now. So that bothers me a lot and really breaks my heart." In 2009, Nicks elaborated further to the West Australian, "I chose purposely, my choice, to not be married or have children so I could follow being a true artist." Although the members of Fleetwood Mac did split up romantically, everybody made a concerted effort to keep the band together. Unfortunately, the band's busy schedule had another unfortunate side effect. Touring night after night quickly took its toll on Stevie Nicks' vocal cords. A July 1977 concert review by New York Times writer John Rockwell revealed Nicks had nodes on her vocal cords. Not only was her voice hoarse, but her mid-range notes were shredded to the point that a few of the band's upcoming concerts were subsequently canceled. The sound of Nicks' voice on stage was also costing the band in the way of bad reviews. Stevie Nicks publicly addressed her issues in August 1977. She told the public that a doctor had informed her that her speaking voice was destroying her singing voice, having aggravated the nodules in her vocal cords. Nicks then recuperated by refraining from talking as Fleetwood Mac took a break from their world tour. At the time, she said, "I just have to do the best I can do." But Rockwell had noticed something else in Fleetwood Mac's concert performance, too. He wrote, "Nicks pushed her lackadaisical loopiness too far. She managed to come in on cue and to remember her words, but at her worst, she looked like a glamorous female equivalent of Joe Cocker, and in general, her slack meanderings were more a cause for concern than for fascination." What Rockwell did not say outright was that Nicks, at this point, was overindulging in drugs and alcohol. Stevie Nicks spent most of the early 1980s as high as a kite. She tried to quit her cocaine habit as early as 1982, but slipped while filming the music video for Gypsy.
It was the first thing I thought of when I woke up in the morning, and the last thing I thought of before I went to bed.
She also began chain-smoking cigarettes, and in 1986, discovered that her cocaine usage had literally burned a hole in the septum of her nose. Nicks' parents and friends finally intervened in the late 1980s. Nicks' close friend, Tom Petty, later told Rolling Stone, "I was very worried about her. If the phone did ring and they said Stevie died, I wouldn't have been surprised." Nicks checked into the Betty Ford Clinic in 1986. 3 songs came from the experience. Welcome to the Room, Sarah, and When I See You Again appeared on Fleetwood Mac's Tango in the Night album in 1987. And I'm Doing the Best I Can appeared on Nicks' own The Other Side of the Mirror album in 1989. By then, however, the singer had been prescribed Klonopin by her psychiatrist and was now addicted to that drug. She entered rehab a final time in 1993. In 1998, Nicks told People magazine that she remembered very clearly that day in 1986 when her plastic surgeon told her that if she wanted her nose to remain on her face, she had to stop using cocaine. Another told her one more snort could cause a brain hemorrhage, but her stints in rehab subsequently caused the petite singer's weight to go up to 175 pounds. At the end of her 1994 tour, Nicks decided, in her own words, "I would never sing in front of people again. Singing is the love of my life, but I was ready to give it all up because I couldn't handle people talking about how fat I was." Unfortunately, Stevie Nicks' weight became the talk of the music world, and it has been suggested that it had an effect on her success in the music industry, with album sales taking a particular hit. This side effect wasn't lost on Nicks herself, who vowed not to go on stage ever again if she didn't lose that weight. In the end, she embarked on a high-protein, low-carb diet in 1995 and ended up shedding 30 pounds. In 1990, Fleetwood Mac produced their first real flop, Behind the Mask. That September, Nicks left the band to pursue her solo career full-time. Her departure has since been attributed to an argument with Mick Fleetwood, who refused to allow Nicks to use her own song, Silver Springs, on a solo project called Time Space. Upon leaving the band, Nicks compiled some of her other hits for Time Space instead, which was relatively well received. A successful tour followed during 1991 and 1992. Nicks did reunite with Fleetwood Mac briefly in the early 90s. Presidential nominee Bill Clinton decided to use the band's hit song Don't Stop for his successful campaign, but both Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham stayed on just long enough to perform a single concert at Clinton's inaugural ball in January 1993 before resuming their solo acts. But Nicks never really wanted a solo career. She told Rolling Stone in 2011, "I always wanted to be just in a band, but I just had so many songs." So it was probably inevitable that Nicks would eventually rejoin Fleetwood Mac. It happened in 1997 for their next album, Dance.
The iconic and funky Red Hot Chili Peppers have been rocking fans for decades, but their history is filled with struggles, pain, and even death, as everyone in the group has struggled with their own demons. This is the tragic real-life story of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. The Red Hot Chili Peppers that most people know are singer Anthony Kiedis, bassist Flea, drummer Chad Smith, and whoever happens to be their current guitarist. From John Frusciante to Dave Navarro to Frusciante again to Josh Klinghoffer to a revolving door of lesser-known names, guitarists have always been the Peppers' equivalent of Spinal Tap drummers. The reason behind that revolving door, though, is rooted in the tragic loss of the band's original lead guitarist Hillel Slovak. In 1988, the 26-year-old Slovak was found lifeless in his apartment. The cause of death was a heroin overdose. Understandably, this shook the rest of the band since Slovak was not only a founding member, but also a massive influence on the others.
I don't think any of us ever really thought that that would happen, even though we were pretty messed up at that point.
Slovak's signature funk rock style essentially established the band's sound, and original drummer Jack Irons decided to leave the band shortly after his passing. Flea has even said that he only picked up the bass instrument because Slovak asked him to. It's easy to assume that a man professionally known as Flea didn't have the most conventional of childhoods, but few could believe just how rough things really were for him. The musician basically grew up in one of the seedier episodes of Breaking Bad, as he was raised in a violent alcoholic household. His father left the family when he was only 6, and his mother and stepfather left the young boy terrified. This less than optimal start in life created a snowball effect that took Flea to some very dark places. By the time he was 11, he sought solace from his turbulent home on the streets, where he'd routinely hang out until 4 a.m. This was also when he started smoking marijuana, and soon enough, he started abusing virtually any drug he could get a hold of. He got in trouble with dealers and cops alike, and gun-toting criminals started lurking around him. Overdoses were a part of life, and Flea lost 3 of his best friends before they turned 26. It was a brutal way of life that he couldn't quite shake until his 30s, and he was 40 before he could consider forgiving his parents for the environment they raised him in. Under the Bridge, released in 1992, is arguably the Red Hot Chili Peppers' most beloved song, and its lyrics are famously about Anthony Kiedis' struggle with drug addiction. But it turns out that the true story behind the song is actually somewhat more complicated than that. Under the Bridge depicts a period in time when the freshly drug-free Kiedis felt growing alienation from his bandmates who were still using drugs, and from society in general. He sought to deal with this by roaming all around Los Angeles, and he ended up developing a fairly interesting connection with the city. As he explained, "I felt an unspoken bond between me and my city. I'd spent so much time wandering through the streets of LA and hiking through the Hollywood Hills that I sensed there was a non-human entity, maybe the spirit of the hills in the city, who had me in her sights and was looking after me." While this strange state of mind contributed to the general feeling of the song, the darker references come from a very specific memory. In his anguished need to score drugs, Kiedis once attempted to enter gang territory under a particular bridge, rumored to be the one in LA's MacArthur Park. He supposedly wormed his way in by pretending that he was engaged to a sister of a gang member. Understandably, he ranks this desperate maneuver as one of the worst depths he's ever sunk to. In 1990, the Red Hot Chili Peppers were wild up-and-comers, and sometimes their crazy onstage antics got more than a little inappropriate. Such was the case with their MTV-filmed Spring Break performance in Daytona Beach, Florida, which led to half the band getting arrested. During the performance, Flea and Chad Smith decided to kick things up a notch by leaping off the stage and assaulting an audience member. The band had already whipped itself into a furious state when Flea unexpectedly pounced a female spectator and started spinning her on his shoulders. Smith joined the fray by pulling her swimsuit aside and slapping her rear end. It got even worse when Flea then got on top of the woman and started to simulate a vulgar act. The shocked woman called for help, and the Peppers were swiftly escorted away. Smith ended up getting charged with battery, while Flea's list of misdeeds included battery, disorderly conduct, and solicitation to commit an unnatural and lascivious act. Chad Smith prefers the occasional drink and joint to hard drugs, and he's referred to his childhood as blue-collar rather than tragic. This has helped him to keep his feet mostly dry even during the years when the rest of the band kept rocking the boat. But that doesn't mean he has no notable weaknesses. In fact, he used to be a self-confessed serial relationship ender. Over the years, he's had 6 children with 4 different women. When The Guardian asked him about this in 2003, he grudgingly admitted this particular flaw in his personality, noting, "I'm the dumper. I fall in love easily, but I get restless. I'll figure it out one day. Can we talk about something else?" To be fair, it appears that Smith indeed fulfilled his promise of figuring it out in the end, as he married his second wife, architect Nancy Mack, in 2004, and they've been together ever since. In 1992, the Red Hot Chili Peppers were on the cusp of true greatness, only for tensions inside the band to almost tear them apart. They were riding high on the wave of their 1991 smash hit album Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and superstardom was there for the taking. But John Frusciante, who was a relatively recent addition at the time, felt uncomfortable with the sudden fame. He started arguing with Anthony Kiedis about the direction of the band. Kiedis remembers Frusciante telling him, "We're too popular. I don't need to be at this level of success. I would just be proud to be playing this music in clubs like you guys were doing 2 years ago." The tensions between Frusciante and the others kept growing, and it didn't exactly help that Kiedis was a recovering addict at the time, while Frusciante was increasingly into drugs. Frusciante botched an important Saturday Night Live performance, which Kiedis called intentional sabotage. Things finally came to a head during a trip to Japan when the disconnected guitarist unexpectedly informed the band's manager that he was out. The other Peppers managed to talk him into playing the show they had scheduled that night, but after that, Frusciante was gone. His departure was so swift that Rolling Stone had to hastily scrub him off the cover photo of an upcoming issue.
I remember thinking before John left that that could happen, that he would leave, or just because things were feeling kind of dysfunctional.
After Frusciante left the Red Hot Chili Peppers for the first time in 1992, his life went downhill so fast, it's almost a miracle that he managed to return to the land of the living. His exit was largely fueled by his desire for creative freedom as opposed to the performing monkey act he believed the Red Hot Chili Peppers were becoming. But when he actually left the band, his creativity was soon curbed by depression, and later, all the heroin and cocaine he could get his hands on. He voluntarily embarked on the path of a full-time junkie with all the nasty trimmings that entailed, to the point that Flea, who had spent his life around drug users, soon drifted away from him. Even when his friend, actor River Phoenix, died of an overdose at the age of 23, Frusciante didn't stray from his path. In 1998, Frusciante eventually realized that he was marching towards an inevitable death, and after a few false starts, he ended his years in the wilderness by becoming stone cold sober. Later that year, he rejoined the struggling Peppers at Flea's behest. At this point, he had suffered 5 near-fatal overdoses, and his teeth were so utterly destroyed that the dental bill was $90,000. However, he was undoubtedly back, and he stayed with the band until 2009. Every rock star worth their salt has feuded with a colleague, and Anthony Kiedis is no exception. His particular opponent of choice was Mike Patton, Faith No More's thousand-voiced frontman. In the 1980s, both bands had a similar funk metal sound, and Faith No More had even played as an opener for the Peppers. However, when both bands started breaking big, Kiedis saw Faith No More's video for the song Epic and took offense, as he felt Patton was copying his mannerisms. Kiedis started taking public potshots at Patton. But when the Faith No More frontman declined to respond, things calmed down. Unfortunately, though, the animosity started anew in 1999 when Patton and his other band, Mr. Bungle, were removed from various festivals. They discovered that this was apparently at the behest of Kiedis, who threatened to pull the Peppers out if Patton's group stayed in the lineup. Why this happened is anyone's guess, though it's worth noting that Mr. Bungle had an album called California coming out at roughly the same time that the Peppers' Californication was released. Regardless, this prompted Patton to start publicly ripping into Kiedis, and another one of his bands, Phantomos, even ruthlessly mocked the Peppers on stage. Fortunately, things seem to have mellowed out since then. In a 2010 interview with Bizarre magazine, Patton said about the feud, "I have no idea what it was about then, and I don't know now, but I'd bet we'd have a warm embrace if we saw each other now." Many bands have found it difficult to work on their new albums, but when it comes to the Red Hot Chili Peppers, their troubles have been a little more serious than the usual "the guitarist wandered off again" variety. In 2018, the Peppers were working on their new album when their efforts were suddenly halted by the monstrous Woolsey Fire, which the Los Angeles Times noted was the most destructive wildfire on record in Los Angeles and Ventura County. While the house the band was working in was ultimately untouched by the flames, both Chad Smith and Anthony Kiedis lived in the Point Dume area, which was badly damaged by the fire, with 70 houses burned down in the community. The band later did their part in rebuilding by playing a benefit show for the victims of the fire at the Hollywood Palladium. In 2018, Flea wrote an essay for Time magazine in which he railed against the opioid crisis. It came from a very personal place, as a musician had broken his arm while snowboarding and had to have surgery. He's grateful to his doctor for fixing the damage so well that his ability to play remained intact, but he also believes that he was prescribed more Oxycontin than he really needed. The supposed dosage was 4 pills a day, but 1 Oxy every 24 hours was enough to kill the pain and to turn him into an emotionless, depressed zombie. Flea ultimately kept his dosage low and stopped popping pills after a month, but he claims that he could have easily gotten a refill. The experience made him realize that the supposedly trustworthy doctors of America prescribe such brain-numbing medication to people from all walks of life, potentially leading to addiction and death. He told the world about this along with his own darker history with substance abuse in an effort to raise awareness of the opioid crisis.
I still, wrestle with a little numbness in there, and I got this real weird lump on my arm. But everything's rocking.
With his tattoos, sculpted beard, and immaculate fashion sense, Dave Navarro is one of the most recognizable guitar players out there. But like many musicians, his life has not been easy. Here are some of the darkest events that shaped Dave Navarro. Navarro has had his share of well-publicized tragedies, but possibly the most terrible one came when the aspiring guitar god was only 15 years old. As NME reported, Navarro's mother, Constance Colleen Hopkins, was murdered in March 1983 when her ex-boyfriend, John Riccardi, shot her and another woman in West Los Angeles. Ultimate Classic Rock reports the murderer spent almost a decade on the loose and was only captured because of a viewer tip after the case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 1991. Riccardi was initially sentenced to death in 1994, but in 2012 the verdict was set aside because of issues with the jury selection process. This didn't mean Riccardi walked free, though, as he was promptly re-sentenced to a life without the possibility of parole. The experience was particularly awful for Navarro because he was supposed to be there on the night of the murders.
It was actually a miracle that I wasn't home, because I think that obviously if I was home that night, it would have gotten me too.
He attributes this turn of events to divine intervention. Less divine, however, is the fact that he still has to fight with the media over the portrayal of the incident. In 2018, Navarro was less than thrilled to discover that Geraldo Rivera's Murder in the Family ran a factually erroneous episode about the case.
As a teenager, Dave loses the family member he cherishes most, taken from him by a violent, jealous man, driven to kill.
In a since-deleted Instagram post, Navarro accused Geraldo of getting the story wrong, adding, "I did not find a body and I did not turn to drugs after this event. I was well on my way to using drugs even before this took place." Navarro entered the limelight as the guitarist of Jane's Addiction, and to say his entrance was explosive is a criminal understatement. Guitar World calls Jane's Addiction a stink bomb that kicked the haughty hair metal bands that ruled the late 1980s airwaves off their pedestals and served as a precursor for grunge with its anti-corporate attitude and raw sound. However, the fact that they burned bright meant they also burned out quickly, releasing just 2 studio albums before self-destructing. In 1991, the band evaporated in a cloud of personal chemistry issues brought on by their hectic touring schedule, which caused increasing strains and fights both on and off stage. The leading personalities of the group, Navarro and singer Perry Farrell, still can't agree on what ultimately caused the collapse. Farrell feels the breakup was, quote, based on emotional reasons, as everyone kept knocking down his ideas and he felt his creativity was facing a wall.
Got into a big sock out, literally body slam.
Navarro, on the other hand, makes it clear he thinks the band was ended by Farrell's intense personality, combined with the band's copious drug use and the fact that they never even tried to talk about their differences.
He convinces you that it's got to be a certain way. And then you know what happens? He's right.
Of course, their 1991 breakup was far from the final one. There have been multiple reunions over the years, but considering the band has broken up more than once, it's possible their communication skills still leave something to be desired. Living a lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is not necessarily conducive for long-term marital happiness, and Navarro is no exception. According to Inquisitor, the rocker has been married 3 times so far, and all of them have ended in disaster. According to MTV News, his first marriage lasted 2 years, and his second was annulled after only a month. Navarro's most high-profile marriage was his third one with actress Carmen Electra. In 2004, the two documented their road to the altar in an MTV show called Till Death Do Us Part, Carmen and Dave, which unsurprisingly gave the impression that the two were genuinely happy together. It wasn't meant to last, though, and in 2006, their marriage fell prey to the oldest of celebrity couple hindrances, conflicting schedules. An anonymous source close to the former couple said at the time, the reality of it is that they're better off as best friends. Navarro has multiple major bands in his resume, but there have been whispers that an even bigger group once courted him for the guitarist spot. In a 2010 interview for the Talking Metal podcast, Navarro confirmed rumors that he once almost joined Guns N' Roses. This came close to happening when Izzy Stradlin left the band in 1991, and Axl Rose even called Navarro to offer him a place in the band, but it never came to be. Navarro says there were multiple reasons why he was ultimately never welcomed to the jungle, but that his significant heroin addiction at the time was the main culprit. According to Guns N' Roses Central, the sad story of a man who was living the rock star lifestyle too hard to join arguably the greatest rock band of the time almost had a heartwarming epilogue when Navarro joined forces with Guns N' Roses in the late 1990s to play on a song of theirs. Unfortunately, the song in question was Oh My God, which the fan site shrugs off as forgettable. For years, Navarro nursed such an impressively awful drug habit that Jane's addiction might as well have been called Dave's addiction. According to Detox to Rehab, the guitar player's drugs of choice were heroin and cocaine, and his drug addiction wasn't exactly cured by the lingering trauma, fear, and loss the murder of his mother caused. Navarro's 2015 documentary Morning Sun pulled no punches about his addiction and even featured graphic footage of his drug use from his younger days. Fortunately, by the time the documentary came out, he was living a much healthier lifestyle. He stopped using both cocaine and heroin in the late 1990s, stopped intravenous use altogether sometime around 2000, and says he's been completely clean and sober since 2012. Navarro may be most famous for Jane's Addiction, but as Guitar World points out, it's hardly the most famous band he has played with. From 1993 to 1998, Navarro was the guitarist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers and was part of the recording lineup when they released 1995's One Hot Minute. However, it was a difficult time for everyone involved. Not only did the band's faithful fans have difficulty accepting Navarro as a full-fledged Chili Pepper, the band members seemingly couldn't get out of bed in the morning without hurting themselves in one way or another. MTV News writes that Navarro's tenure in the band was marked by a series of disasters ranging from motorcycle accidents to drug relapses, and his exit was a weird mess of conflicting statements. Everyone involved praised each other and their time together, but Navarro himself said he quit the band, while singer Anthony Kiedis called the lineup shuffle a, quote, completely mutual parting based on creative differences, and Guitar World says the guitarist was fired. The creative differences part is pretty much the only thing everyone's narratives seem to agree on. Kicking a heroin habit can be difficult, especially when your job requires you to revisit a past situation that had you at your worst. According to Alternative Nation, this was the unfortunate scenario Navarro faced in 1997 when the recently reunited Jane's Addiction started rehearsing. To make things worse, vocalist Perry Farrell had not yet discovered the joys of sobriety, so when Navarro stepped in the room, a relapse he later described as epic was all but imminent. Feeling that the music would be infinitely better on heroin, Navarro decided his bottle of mineral water was unable to satisfy his cravings. He and Farrell soon got so high that it evoked an "oh no, here we go again" reaction from drummer Stephen Perkins. Navarro describes the tour that followed as one of the most over-the-top, drug-fueled things he has ever done, and says he was easily the worst junkie of the band, using so openly and blatantly that he later called it dangerous and disgusting, even if he did have a pretty good time. However, one guy who enjoyed himself significantly less was Red Hot Chili Pepper Flea, who took care of bass duties for the tour and, as a former drug addict, was not a fan of Navarro's antics. In 2015, Stone Temple Pilots and Velvet Revolver singer Scott Weiland died in his sleep at age 48. It might initially seem odd that Navarro was the guy who led the outpouring of tributes for the frontman, but as Alternative Nation notes, the two were good friends. Weiland, according to Rolling Stone, suffered from his own share of inner demons and substance abuse problems, and he died of an accidental overdose on a tour stop in Minnesota. Weiland made a big difference in Navarro's life and mental health outlook by hooking the guitarist up with his current therapist. Navarro still keeps Weiland close at heart. In a 2018 Instagram post, he shared a photo of an unfinished letter Weiland had once started writing to him. It reads, "Dave, my only real concern for you and I is that, sadly, the letter will never be finished." The fame game is a difficult one, and sometimes there are casualties. According to NME, one that hit Navarro particularly hard was the death of Soundgarden and Audioslave frontman Chris Cornell, who took his own life in 2017 after struggling with depression for years. Cornell and Navarro knew each other, and when they toured together in 2003, they fell into a habit of meeting people in rehab, hanging out with them, and helping them toward sobriety. While interviewing Cornell's Audioslave bandmate Tom Morello in 2018, Navarro opened up about the profound pain he suffered when he heard the news of the singer's death, saying, "To still have that hole in yourself and still feel that depression and loneliness and isolation, especially on tour, I identified so deeply with that, and I felt so much loss and pain about that. That's the one that hit me the hardest." He claimed he put on Soundgarden and began weeping inconsolably because he was so familiar with the kind of depression Cornell had been fighting with. Navarro isn't one to shy away from talking about his mental health struggles, particularly because doing so can help others in the same situation. According to Billboard, the musician has been as close to the darkest parts of the human mind as a person can possibly be. In 2018, the suicides of Anthony Bourdain and designer Kate Spade prompted Navarro to write an Instagram post about his own disturbingly close call with ending his life. At one point, things were so bad for the guitar player that he actually wrote a suicide note, stockpiled pills, and even planned out how to distribute his belongings to his surviving family. However, as a last-ditch effort, he decided to reach out to his loved ones, which was enough to stay his hand and make him decide to seek professional help. Fortunately, therapists, psychiatrists, medication, and hospitalization eventually pulled him back from that dark place.
One of the most successful American rock bands in history, Bon Jovi is a household name around the globe. But the members of the group have suffered their fair share of setbacks. Here are some of the darker and more challenging moments in the lives of the famous bandmates. According to Rolling Stone, when Bon Jovi taped its 2007 episode of Unplugged, there were rumors flying around the set that guitarist Richie Sambora was too drunk to play. His team denied that there were any problems. Nevertheless, a few days after the June 5th session, a band representative told Us Weekly that Sambora had checked into a Los Angeles drug treatment facility to address his issues with alcohol. A source also told Us Weekly that Sambora was going through a hard time following a rapid chain of stressful events that included the death of his father, the finalization of his divorce from Heather Locklear, and relationship problems with girlfriend Denise Richards. A few months later, Sambora spent an additional week in rehab at Utah's Cirque Lodge facility. Addiction recovery is a journey, and sometimes that road is rocky. In March 2008, while driving in California, Sambora was pulled over for weaving across lanes. After failing field sobriety tests, he was arrested, booked, and released about 5 hours later. The guitarist faced as many as 6 months in prison. He ultimately pleaded no contest to a charge of drunk driving and received probation, charged fines, and ordered to take an alcohol education class. In 2011, Sambora decided to admit himself to a drug treatment center once again to seek help. Sambora explained to Extra that his 14-year-old daughter motivated him to stop drinking when she told him to clean up his act.
We were going through it as a family together. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it was like her saying that to me, and that kind of was like, okay, that's it. Yeah. That was it, man.
While Bon Jovi was on a hiatus in the early 90s and before recording its 5th studio album, Keep the Faith, the band's members pursued various projects. John Bon Jovi recorded his solo debut, Blaze of Glory, and Richie Sambora made his record, Stranger in This Town. Bon Jovi keyboardist David Bryan played all over Sambora's album while also recording the score for the movie Netherworld. Unfortunately, he also spent a large portion of his Bon Jovi hiatus recovering from parasites he believes he acquired when the band toured through South America. These dangerous little creatures absolutely ravaged Bryan's body. He lost 40 pounds and could have died. Bryan told Keyboard Magazine in 1993, "They ate out my intestines and my stomach and put me out of commission for about 6 months." Bryan went on to make a full recovery, and to this day he continues to enjoy a very long, successful career with Bon Jovi. In 1989, John Bon Jovi married Dorothea Hurley, his longtime love who he met in high school. They've raised 4 kids together, starting off with his eldest daughter, Stephanie. Sadly, the family has had some ups and downs. In November 2012, police and paramedics were summoned to a dormitory at Hamilton College in upstate New York in response to a call that Stephanie was unresponsive, possibly due to a drug overdose. It was a traumatic moment for the family, but luckily she was treated and quickly released from a local hospital. In an interview with Katie Couric, Bon Jovi said, "That problem is much more prevalent than I knew. It happens to all kinds of families all over." He added that Stephanie was doing great and gave a positive update on the situation.
You know, I'm just blessed that she's healthy and whole, and we're getting through it. We've got
That's
to.
good.
Despite being the drummer in an incredibly successful band for nearly 40 years, Tico Torres has kept his personal life relatively quiet. It wasn't until 2009 with the Bon Jovi documentary, When We Were Beautiful, that he opened up about his struggles with addiction. He explained in the documentary, "I was killing myself with drinking years ago. I was the kind of person who wouldn't drink for months and then just load off 2 bottles." His bandmate, Jon Bon Jovi, confirmed it. He had a lot of demons. He was a really bad drunk. He'd get in a lot of trouble with a lot of people. As of the making of that documentary, Torres considered himself a sober, recovering alcoholic. After 30 years with the band, guitarist Richie Sambora abruptly quit Bon Jovi in 2013. Sambora said that there was no bad blood between him and his bandmates, and he had made the decision quickly between legs of a tour. He elaborated on the Today Show Australia.
And I just started spending time with my kid between legs, and my spirit wouldn't pull myself out of the door. I just needed to be home.
Sambora's sudden departure blindsided the other members of the band. According to The Mirror, Jon Bon Jovi said, "Everything was great and we were just coming off of a break, but he never came back to work again. It was a shock." A couple years after the split with Sambora, Bon Jovi released Burning Bridges, the band's final album on Mercury Records. That title was a not-so-thinly veiled announcement that Bon Jovi was frustrated and ready to break free from Mercury. Losing Sambora and leaving his record label left Jon Bon Jovi in a very low place that lasted for years. He told The Mirror, "There was a lot of darkness, really. I was going through a difficult period and it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders." Bon Jovi worked hard to make it big, and the band finally did when back-to-back singles You Give Love a Bad Name and Livin' on a Prayer from the 1986 album Slippery When Wet topped the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart. The support tour for the album took up most of 1986 and 1987. Then they had to head back into the studio to record the 1988 album New Jersey. Achieving and maintaining that kind of success and fulfilling all the duties it requires can leave a person physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. According to The Mirror, that's how Jon Bon Jovi was feeling in the early 90s when he suffered a breakdown. In fact, those feelings were so awful and strong that he almost made a devastating decision. While on his way to see a psychologist, Bon Jovi was driving along the Pacific Coast Highway in California, and he considered jumping out of the moving car and ending it all. Fortunately for everyone, that didn't happen, and he went on to create decades of great music, be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and consistently inspire his fans all around the world.
Life hasn't been easy for guitar legend Carlos Santana. In fact, it's been a long and bumpy road to legendary status for the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, and his real-life story is full of tragedy. Here are some of the things he's had to tough through. Born in southern Mexico, Carlos Santana's family moved to Tijuana when he was 7. He told Rolling Stone his father put him and his brothers to work, selling gum on the street, shining shoes, and eventually singing Mexican folk songs. Showing an aptitude for the guitar, he soon accompanied his bar musician father to gigs in dirt-floored saloons full of shady characters. By age 14, Santana went off on his own, earning $9 a week providing musical accompaniment to strippers. He didn't get a lot of pleasure out of the work, saying, "It's just watching an assembly job. After a while, you learn the most sensual thing is innocence." During this time, Santana says he was abused by an American man who would buy him food, clothes, and toys, and then take him into the US and abuse him. After the man slapped him for watching a woman through a window, Santana explained, "I looked at him for the first time for who he was, a very sick person." Santana's family moved to San Francisco when he was a teenager, but he didn't want to move, nor attend what he perceived as a boring American junior high. Santana recalled to Rolling Stone that he was constantly angry and upset, even refusing to eat.
It was a shock and a horror. It's like I was in this man's world and I come back to junior high school.
Things got even worse when some of his money went missing. He'd saved up a small fortune to pay for immigration papers, only to discover that his mother stole it to pay for his sister's dental work. She left $300 behind, which Santana planned to use to buy a new Stratocaster guitar. When he asked his mother for the $300, she revealed that she'd spent it on rent. Santana was so angry that he took the $20 his mother offered him and went back to Tijuana. He returned to the strip club world until a year later when his estranged family forcibly retrieved him. He said, "They actually kidnapped me, put me in a car." In the spring of 1967, while fronting the Santana Blues Band and still in high school, Santana had gone from busking on the streets of San Francisco to opening for The Who. His work impressed the likes of Steve Miller and blues legend Howlin' Wolf, and both invited Santana's band to open for them on tour. Sadly, the group didn't get the chance because 19-year-old Carlos Santana was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He told Rolling Stone that he spent 3 months in San Francisco General Hospital getting regular penicillin treatments. At one point, he developed an aversion to the drugs, so medical staff started injecting the antibiotics into his rear end. Unable to sit down for weeks, Santana worked with a tutor to finish up his high school education and graduated while hospitalized. The first 3 Santana albums deftly fused jazz, Latin music, and psychedelic rock to create something fresh and popular. The self-titled Santana hit #1 on the album chart and was certified double platinum, while follow-ups Abraxas and Santana 3 did as well or better, going quintuple and double platinum respectively. But when it came time to release album number 4, Caravanserai, in 1972, Santana and his bandmates faced resistance from the record label. It was an almost vocals-free experimental jazz record recorded with an almost entirely new band to reflect Santana's new spiritual side. Columbia Records didn't want to release it, and Santana wrote in his memoir that company president Clive Davis said it would end his career, but it was a top 10 hit. 2 years later, Santana once again earned Davis's ire. The live album Lotus, as originally presented, was a 3 LP set. Citing its commercial risk, Columbia only released it in Japan, killing some momentum for Santana and representing another professional setback. Unless they shelled out for an import, fans couldn't buy it in the US until a CD reissue in 1991. Columbia Records dropped Santana after the release of 1990's Spirits Dancing in the Flesh, his 3rd straight album not to go gold or platinum. The label Polydor released Santana's 1992 record, Milagro, which also flopped. After that, Santana couldn't get a record deal, and he couldn't record anywhere without a contract. In 1997, after the death of his musician father, Santana found that even listening to music was too much to bear. After a mourning period, he finally felt ready to try again. His wife at the time, Deborah King Santana, suggested that he reconnect with Davis, then an executive at Arista Records. The result was Supernatural, one of the most significant comeback albums in pop history, a 1999 collection of collaborations between Santana and young pop and rock stars. It sold 13 million copies in the US and won 8 Grammy Awards. Santana probably wouldn't have his storied, successful career without a well-timed big break from Bill Graham. The powerful manager and concert promoter convinced Woodstock's organizer to book a slot for Santana's band. The group gave an electrifying performance.
We were in this helicopter and I never seen so many, it was like an ocean of hair and teeth and arms.
Within a year, they were topping the charts. Graham and Santana remained close until Graham's tragic death in November 1991 in a helicopter accident in Vallejo, California. Graham was 61. Santana played through his grief at a memorial concert in San Francisco. Another friend, legendary trumpeter Miles Davis, died just 2 months before Graham did. Santana said in a 1992 interview with the Charlotte Observer, "They sharpened my tenacity, they sharpened my convictions." Santana and his ex-wife Deborah King went through a lot of ups and downs. They married in 1973 and had 3 children. Partners in business as well as life, they opened a small chain of Mexican restaurants, established a charity called the Milagro Foundation, and in 1994, King restructured and saved her husband's finances. But Santana wasn't always the most faithful husband. Deborah told the San Francisco Chronicle that after their children were born, Santana was sleeping with people on the road. Santana admitted his infidelity in his memoir and publicly apologized for his indiscretions. But a little over 2 years later, Deborah filed for divorce. Santana moved on, and in 2010 proposed to Cindy Blackman, the drummer in his band. After his divorce, the guitarist's life grew alarmingly dark. Santana seriously entertained thoughts of ending it all, and in 2008, he told Rolling Stone that he'd attempted to take his own life 7 times. Not only did the failure of his marriage upset him, but so did lingering memories of the regular abuse he suffered in his youth. Santana credits his faith for helping him out of that very low place. He told plain truth, you have to go through the darkest night of the soul to get to the brightest light of the day. Forgiveness, man. Forgiveness is incredibly liberating.
Even though Ringo Starr was a member of the Beatles, his success hasn't saved him from the depressing side of life. In fact, he's had more than his fair share of tough times. Here are some tragic details of this drummer's life. All four of the Beatles famously hailed from Liverpool, one of England's largest cities and home to large populations of working and middle-class people. But while John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison all grew up in homes that were secure, if not wealthy, Starr's upbringing was a bit more economically unstable. As his childhood neighbour Mary Maguire Crawford was quoted in The Beatles, a biography, he was not a barefoot, ragged child, but like all of the families who lived in the dingle, he was part of an ongoing struggle to survive. The dingle was an especially depressed neighborhood, full of tiny, decrepit homes with poor ventilation. The only place for kids to play was a local park, where all the coal smoke from area chimneys hung thick in the air. Those circumstances were made all the more trying when Starr's father abandoned the family when Ringo was only 3 years old. During the Beatles' time together, there was a through line of disrespect towards Ringo. He was only allowed to sing lead on 11 songs and write 2 unassisted, and he didn't even get to play on one of the group's earliest and biggest hits. Producer George Martin didn't like the drumming that Starr turned in for Love Me Do, so he brought in a session drummer named Andy White to play drums on that track and the B-side P.S. I Love You. Starr was demoted to playing the tambourine and maracas. Toward the end of the 1960s, the band life of the Beatles was famously contentious. It got so bad in 1968 for Starr that he briefly left the band in the middle of recording the White Album. As he described the situation, I felt I wasn't playing great, and I also felt the other 3 were really happy, and I was an outsider. While Starr took his family on vacation to Sardinia, the other Beatles recorded without him. They took bits and pieces of work he'd previously recorded and some new drum work by Paul McCartney to cobble together the rhythmic backing track for Back in the USSR. When Starr returned, his bandmates at least welcomed him back by covering his drum kit in flowers.
Say, hey Ringo, this is your song for the album. We hear your voice on this?
No, he said, you're doing that.
After the Beatles split up in 1970, all 4 members enjoyed solo success. For his part, Starr had 8 singles in a row that all reached the top 10 in the US, including the #1 hits Photograph and You're 16. The albums Ringo and Goodnight Vienna went platinum and gold respectively, but then the public seemingly grew tired of what he was offering. In 1976, Ringo's Rotogravure stalled at number 28 on the US charts, and the singles A Dose of Rock and Roll and Hey Baby tanked as well. The 1977 and 1978 albums Ringo IV and Bad Boy straight up flopped, reaching just number 162 and 129 respectively on the Billboard charts. After Starr left his label over a dispute, it took him 3 years to record and release more music. With 1981's Stop and Smell the Roses, he enjoyed a modest comeback with the number 38 hit Rack My Brain, a song written by former bandmate George Harrison. But Stop and Smell the Roses sold so poorly that RCA Records dropped Starr. Starr met his first wife, Maureen Cox, at the Cavern Club, the venue where the Beatles cut their teeth. The 2 of them wed in 1965, had 3 children together, and the marriage weathered the storm of worldwide fame and attention, but just barely, and not, as it turned out, for the long haul.
Does that worry you, that the fact that, you can't go anywhere with him?
No, not really. I just sort of enjoy myself.
Cox had a brief affair with George Harrison. After she and Starr grew apart in the mid-70s, Starr struck up a relationship with model Nancy Lee Andrews, leading to a divorce which was finalized in 1975. According to John Lennon's first wife, Cynthia, Cox was so devastated that she attempted to take her own life by running a motorcycle into a wall. She survived, but she endured a lengthy cosmetic surgery to correct her facial injuries. Starr and Cox both remarried, but they reportedly remained cordial. They stayed so friendly, in fact, that Starr was with his former wife when she passed away in December 1994. She underwent a bone marrow transplant from their son Zach that was intended to treat leukemia. Sadly, the procedure didn't completely improve her health, and she died from complications of the surgery at age 47. 1970 was the year that the Beatles split up, but Ringo at least had something in his personal life to celebrate that year, as his first daughter and third child overall was born. Lee Starkey stayed out of the spotlight for decades, unlike some other famous Beatles offspring. But then she made headlines in the fall of 1995 when she suddenly fell seriously ill. After collapsing and then being hospitalized in London, Lee Starkey was diagnosed with a brain tumor. After having fluid drained from her skull, she was transferred to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where a neurosurgeon performed an experimental 4-hour operation on her. The tumor was removed entirely, and she was quickly discharged. Her father was reportedly by her bedside for the ordeal, and he stayed with her in Boston for 6 weeks after, when she underwent 8-minute radiation treatments every day. In 2001, the tumor returned, and Starkey had to endure more medical treatments, but she thankfully managed to survive those as well.
Everybody can relate to the people and themes in John Mellencamp's music. That's because he's a real guy who's lived a few lifetimes worth of drama and struggle. Here's a look into the tragic, real-life story that shaped the life and work of John Mellencamp. Mellencamp's songs are often from the point of view of the underdog. They're about hardworking individuals from small towns trying to get a leg up to be able to afford a little pink house. That's a struggle Mellencamp witnessed in his hometown of Seymour, Indiana, and within his own family. His father, Richard, met his mother when he literally ran into her on the street one day. As Mellencamp told the New York Times in 1987, Richard and his older brother, Joe, were running from cops after roughing up 4 guys in retaliation for a beating Richard had gotten earlier. Those Mellencamps were playing the detestable part in which the community had cast them. As Mellencamp explained, for as far back as anyone can care to remember, there has been a rigid, petty, small-town class system in Seymour. The top of that system was occupied by people who became rich during the Industrial Revolution, while the rest were farmers. The singer's great-great-grandfather moved from Germany to Indiana in 1851 and started the family farm, which had to be sold a generation later. That left John's grandfather, Harry, to drop out of school in the 3rd grade to work as a carpenter. When Harry went to register to vote, the clerk laughed at him and made fun of his name. As John put it, we were always hearing talk that you low-class Mellencamps will never amount to anything. At the age of 18, Mellencamp was dating a woman 3 years older than him named Priscilla Esterline. When she became pregnant in 1970, the couple tried to do the traditional thing and get married, but under Indiana law at the time, 18-year-old Mellencamp wasn't old enough to do so without parental permission. But that's when the couple hit upon a solution. They eloped to Kentucky, the next state over. That marriage lasted a little over a decade through Mellencamp's early career hurdles, stumbles, and dead ends. But it couldn't survive when he fell for another woman. After seeing a photo of professional TV extra Vicky Granucci at a friend's house, Mellencamp became infatuated. When they finally met, it turned out they actually had fantastic chemistry. He and Esterline quickly split up so that Mellencamp could marry Granucci, who notably stars as Diane in Mellencamp's Jack and Diane video. 2 months after they made it official, they welcomed their first daughter, Teddy Jo, who would later go on to become a cast member on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. After he married Granucci, Mellencamp's history of tumultuous love affairs still wasn't over, as he would once again fall for a new woman, leave his current wife, marry the new gal, and put her in a music video. This time, it was Elaine Irwin, whom he met when she was the cover model for his 1991 album, Whenever We Want It. 10 weeks after their first face-to-face, they were engaged, and in 1992, they married. She's also the star of his video for Get a Leg Up. This third marriage lasted a long time, almost 18 years, but it nonetheless fell apart as surely as the first two.
Apparently, women just don't like me very much. That's all I can say about that.
In 2011, not long after his divorce was finalized, Mellencamp struck up an on-again, off-again relationship with movie star Meg Ryan, a coupling that apparently left the rocker a little wounded. When he appeared on Howard Stern's radio show after splitting with the actress in 2014, he revealed, "Oh, women hate me. I loved Meg Ryan. She hates me to death." But all was not lost forever. After a year-long relationship with model Christy Brinkley, Mellencamp and Ryan reunited, and in November 2018, they got engaged.
How did you figure out at 67 now, let's do this thing for real?
I don't know what you mean.
While John Mellencamp suffered from a potentially fatal birth defect as a baby, his third child similarly faced an uncertain future. In 1985, Mellencamp and his wife at the time, Vicky Granucci, awaited the arrival of their second child together. While she was pregnant, Granucci fell ill with chickenpox, and doctors informed the expectant parents that the illness might result in fetal deformity. Mellencamp told the New York Times, "We were so terrified, maybe the way my parents were with my spinal problems at birth." Mellencamp also noted that he and Granucci were so afraid of losing their child that they didn't decide on a name until the day Granucci gave birth. He told the Times, "As the doctor began the delivery, we decided that if there was any justice in the world, the baby would be healthy. In the end, she was just fine, and accordingly, since there appeared to be justice in the world, Mellencamp and Granucci named their new daughter Justice." Mellencamp has left alcohol and marijuana behind, but he's not a man totally devoid of vice, as he's an enthusiastic lifelong smoker. As he revealed in a 2018 interview with CBS News, he started puffing on cigarettes at the tender age of 10, and he doesn't think more than 5 decades of the habit have been all that bad for him, and he's got a bit of a theory about that. That theory may not carry too much weight, though, considering that Mellencamp suffered a heart attack in 1994 at the relatively young age of 42. He was on tour and he didn't feel well, so he went back to his hometown of Bloomington, Indiana to consult with doctors there. He later spoke about the health scare during an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman, mentioning that when the doctor told him he was having a heart attack, he went nuts and called him, quote, everything in the book.
And he said, "John, you can say whatever you want to me or act any way you want, but a first-year medical student could tell you you've had a heart attack." Wow.
Nevertheless, Mellencamp didn't entirely quit smoking after that. He just cut down from 4 packs a day to 1.
This is the number for the Surgeon General.
Mellencamp's road to fame and fortune as an authentic rock and roll star wasn't traditional or short. By the time he scored his first top 30 hit in the United States with I Need a Lover in 1979, he was almost 30 years old, which is fairly long in the tooth for the youth-oriented music industry. And that came after he'd already recorded 2 misbegotten albums that each failed in their own unique way. In 1975, Mellencamp, tired of playing in go-nowhere bar bands, moved to New York City to make it as a rock star. He found a champion in David Bowie's former manager, Tony DeFries. Bowie had just unamicably parted ways with DeFries, and so the manager tried to position Mellencamp as the next Bowie by way of Bruce Springsteen. Saddled with the silly stage name of Johnny Cougar, Mellencamp released his first album, the DeFries-produced Chestnut Street Incident, in 1976. It consisted primarily of covers of familiar tunes like Jailhouse Rock and Hit the Road Jack. It sold only a paltry 12,000 copies. Afterwards, Mellencamp's label, MCA, refused to release his next album, The Kid Inside, and then dropped him entirely. Mellencamp experienced some hard-rocking success with the release of his albums American Fool and Uh-Huh in 1982 and 1983, respectively. Then he doubled down on the social commentary and soul-searching with 1985's Scarecrow and 1987's The Lonesome Jubilee. Among the biggest sellers of his career, they went on to be certified 5 times platinum and 3 times platinum, respectively. But the success of those albums bears a painful origin, as Mellencamp created Scarecrow and The Lonesome Jubilee to cope with the deaths of loved ones and how his family shaped him. As he told the New York Times in 1987, "Let's face it, you are your parents, whether any of us like it or not. The Lonesome Jubilee, like Scarecrow and the rest of my best stuff, is about me and my family tree grappling against both the world and our own inner goddamned whirlwind." His grandfather, with whom he was incredibly close, died of lung cancer in 1983. Mellencamp shared with The Times, "Just before his death, he called everybody into his bedroom, and although he wasn't a religious person, he said, 'You know, I'm having a real bad beating of a time with the devil.' It stopped me cold to see my grandpa so scared. 6 hours later, he was gone." After that death, John Mellencamp's Uncle Joe became, quote, "the kindest soul you could imagine." But then he died too. Mellencamp has revealed that the song Paper and Fire from The Lonesome Jubilee is about Joe and his family's ingrained anger. It's widely known that Mellencamp was born in a small town, specifically the south-central Indiana burg of Seymour. He's easily the town's most famous son, but the second most famous might be George Green. He and Mellencamp have known each other since they were in the same Sunday school class, and they would later go on to write some songs together. In fact, Green helped Mellencamp pen some of his best-known tunes, including Hurts So Good, Crumbling Down, Rain on the Scarecrow, and Human Wheels. The last song they wrote together was Yours Forever for the soundtrack to the 2000 film The Perfect Storm. Soon after, they had a falling out. Mellencamp wrote about their split in the liner notes to his 2010 box set On the Rural Route 7609. Like when you're married, when you're friends with somebody for a long time, the more things build up, the more things can go wrong. There were personal problems cross-pollinated with professional issues. George has written some great lyrics and we've written some great songs together, but I just couldn't do it anymore. After that fallout, they never collaborated again, as Green died in 2011 at age 59 after a short battle with an aggressive form of lung cancer. Mellencamp has projected an image as somebody who likes to get rowdy and mix it up. After all, he's the guy who fights authority, even though authority always wins. It turns out that his sons, Hud and Speck, have lived out the central battle described in Authority song out in the real world. In the early morning of July 16, 2017, Hud and Speck got into a fight in the parking lot of a Jimmy John's sandwich shop in Bloomington, Indiana. According to the police report, a small group of men started mouthing off to the Mellencamp boys, and then things escalated. Hud said that somebody hit him, while Speck had blood on his face by the time police showed up. Speck was sentenced to community service and probation after pleading guilty to a count of public intoxication. This isn't the first time Speck and Hud have run afoul of the law. In 2015, Speck served 4 days of jail time for a misdemeanor battery charge over an incident in 2013 in which the brothers kicked a teenager they thought had hit Speck. At this rate, it looks like the troubles in the Mellencamp family will continue for generations to come.